small request. We are a smaller group, so it would make better sense if we could stick to the first sort of tables in front, so that we can get a better discussion going. So please, if you could indulge us and move to the first sort of tables, circle of tables. Thanks, Jens. So that we can get started. Uh, okay. Okay. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the third roundtable discussions on the Code of Good Practice on a just transition. So we have had a roundtable. In fact, we started with civil society and the community constituency. That was on Monday. We then had a session with organized labor on yesterday, actually. And then we are now having a dedicated session for government. But to be quite honest, if you are not from the designated group, that doesn't preclude you from the conversation. We would like to have as many views and insights as possible from various stakeholders. Just to indicate, it's interesting what's happened. We had so many RSVPs. I'm not too sure what happened to the actual participants, but I think for the sake of time, we're just going to continue with the conversation and just take inputs from those that are in the room. I just want to take us through a few sort of logistical issues, really. Just to request that we are recording the session and we are transcribing. So if you could please keep your phone on silent for us. Most of you should be familiar with NEDLEC and its offices. If not, just in the foyer, you'll be directed to where the bathrooms are as well as where the exits are. I noticed that in all the sessions, I never introduced myself. So I'm going to start and actually introduce myself. My name is Lebogang Molaisi. I head up research and policy for the Presidential Climate Commission. And as part of the PAGE program or its second iteration, the PCC is leading that work. So we are currently supported by the ILO that's in the room here today, as well as a number of other UN agencies. When Jens does his presentation, you'll have an understanding of which UN agencies are supporting the PAGE program. I just also want to introduce the ILO team that's here. Tina's here, Matilda's here, as well as Jens, who have been supporting us, especially in terms of getting the Code of Good Practice underway. You will hear a lot about what we mean with regards to this Code of Good Practice on a just transition. The concept note did try to explain it, but we'll get into it in more depth in today's discussion. Renee is here she's an independent consultant assisting UNITAR to develop a tool or a toolkit of some sorts to assist social partners negotiate for a just transition. What we've noticed is that we've said to social partners that it is important to begin negotiating for a just transition, but what we're starting to realize is that there are not enough tools to help guide the process. So it really gets stuck at just an aspiration and nothing happens at the level of implementation and impact. So UNITAR, through the creation of a tool, is going to assist us to get that process underway. I just want to quickly get into the 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 agenda for today. Um, we did start a bit late. We just wanted to see if the numbers would improve. But we will find a way to catch up throughout the agenda. So what we'll be getting into is just some context setting that I will do in terms of where we've started in terms of South Africa's just transition journey and and why this is the right time for us to translate aspiration and principles into practical guidance and guidelines. And then after my presentation, Jens is going to come and do some reflections on the just transition framing. This is really going to be based on the experience of the International Labour Organization. I mean, the ILO has been quite instrumental, especially when we look at the concept of a just transition and also getting it mainstream into the Paris Agreement, as well as the general discussion on a just transition at the International Labour Conference in 2023. He'll give us some insights in terms of that. And then we're going to go into a presentation by Professor Harun Borat. We spelled his name wrong on the agenda, but it's Professor Borat from UCT, particularly in the DPRU, who's done a really interesting study around the labor market in South Africa and its implications for a just transition. We'll then get into a discussion, and then afterwards, Lisa Seftel, who will join us by the time we have the discussion, will then get into the nitty-gritties of what a code is and what it is not, what we can achieve through a code of good practice, as well as what are the other practical instruments that could complement a code of good practice. After our lunch break, we're going to get into a session around international experience, and these international experiences, also noting that, different country contexts are unique in nature. But it's always good to reflect on what other countries have been able to achieve through social dialogue. The second iteration of the PAGE program is very much social partner driven. So we'd like to hear from their point of view and the role that government has played in guiding these discussions. And then after that, we'll have just a few reflections, and then we'll close off the session for today. There we go. So I just want to go through quickly a number of slides just to set a little bit of context. Sure. Okay, there we go. And a great place to always start is always at the just transition framework for South Africa. It's really important to start here because this really is the first sort of concrete attempt at developing a unified vision for a just transition for South Africa. And at its core, really, it's about seeking equitable distribution of risks and responsibilities, especially in the context of historical liability for climate catastrophes. The broad vision is definitely around inclusive approaches, as well as how to practically support workers as well as communities, and using the opportunity that the transition provides us with to tangibly and practically, structurally change the economy, particularly for those who have been previously disadvantaged. So again, what's nice about the framework for South Africa is that it has really great aspirations, and it unifies us around a common vision for what a just transition can be for the South African context. Is the clicker not working today? Have we run out of batteries as well? Can we go to the next slide, please? So what's also important about the framework is its clear articulation of what principles embed the just transition for South Africa. And I mean, I've seen a number of just transition documents and policies in various countries. Some of it is similar, or some of them prioritize different things. But like I said, the country context is also very important. And in the South African context, grappling with issues related to high poverty, high unemployment, and inequality, these were the principles that embed South Africa's just transition journey to a low carbon economy. So one of them includes distributive justice, and you'll hear us talk about it quite a bit in today's session around, how to ensure equitable distribution of risks and responsibility across society. So veering away from the status quo that transitions negatively impact workers and communities while creating a few winners, distributive justice ensures that there's more equitable distribution of the risks as well as the opportunities. Restorative justice deals with the issues related to redress, which is a contentious issue here in South Africa. I think we can all agree that post 1994, issues related to redress have been not adequately addressed, but the just transition again affords us an opportunity to enter into restorative justice and adequate redress. Procedural justice refers to empowering workers and communities, even small businesses, so that they can define their own development pathways and shape decision makers, as well as how policies are then implemented. So as I've been saying in the previous roundtable discussions, frameworks are nice documents because you can say everything and nothing in the same vein. So the practical challenge now is how to effect distributive justice, restorative justice, as well as procedural justice. And as I've been saying in the roundtable discussion, this is where the rubber hits the road, and this becomes quite it becomes quite challenging to effect in a manner that is practical and that works. And this is the process that we are now trying to get into as we work towards the development of a code of good practice. Next slide, please. So still on the framework, useful in the sense that, it gives us the unified vision, it articulates the principles, highlight who the at-risk groups are, planning elements, which I'll get into just now, as well as the policy measures that we need to pull, which are necessary levers that can help us achieve the vision of a just transition. Next slide, please. So for today's discussion, I mean, we've been quite specific around the fact that we want to develop a code of good practice. And those of you who have come across codes of good practice in the LRA, you would then understand that codes of good practice are really labor market tools that help us to achieve norms, standards, basic rules, and just some sort of uniformity in terms of practical application, in this case with regards to the just transition, because there are real workplace as well as labor market impacts that a just transition or a transition would impose. But we can also agree that our just transition journey is broader than just the labor market. There's issues related to economic diversification, social support, governments, as well as the finance considerations. But a code of good practice really just limits us to the labor market. So having had conversations and also reflecting on the just transition framework, we understand that to realize the just transition, you need to address several areas and you need to do this simultaneously. All right. So even with this process of developing a code of good practice, you will see that we have identified issues related to economic diversification, social support, governance in the sense that there are roles and responsibilities as well as just broader integration that needs to take place, as well as issues related to finance. But how we can address this is not necessarily through a code, but through other supplementary instruments that we also want to run past you here today, so that we can have a conversation around how all of this can work together while we apply the simultaneous focus. I think for those that are in the room who've worked on the just transition for quite some time, you can attest to the fact that there's growing frustration in communities, among the workforce, and just society in general around the fact that the just transition is not tangibly felt in society. Even though there's a lot of activity that's going on, I think everybody's working on the just transition, but we're not seeing the tangible impacts of it in society, which is a problem. Because at some point, we will run out of steam and society will completely disregard us because anyway, they never got any benefit out of this thing. So it's important to coordinate efforts and ensure that there is impact. So it's very difficult to see that impact if certain areas of the aspect are worked on in isolation. So there is a need for better coordination as we simultaneously focus on the various planning needs. So next slide, please. Oh, is it working? Okay, great. Thank you. It's always good to tie what we're talking about to actual lessons. So the most practical lesson can always be found in the decommissioning of the Komati power station. And I always say to the teams here at the PCC that the reasons for decommissioning are not important. What really is important for us to focus on is the manner in which decommissioning took place, the promises that were made to communities, and what subsequently happened to date. Following a request from the president, the PCC did commission a study on the decommissioning process at Komati and developed a recommendations document to the presidency as well as to ESCOM and a number of players as well. And this can be accessed from the PCC website. And from those recommendations, what was identified as a challenge is really the issues related to timing, sequencing, and the sequencing of events. So making the decision to decommission before you've identified areas for repurposing is problematic in nature. And just the manner in which events took place was highly problematic, particularly for the communities, because not enough time was given to bring on board alternative economic activities, even though there are things that are happening in Komati village, but there's just a feeling that not enough time was dedicated to proper planning, adequate other measures in terms of economic development and diversification, and also bringing everybody onto the same page. And then there was an issue related to engagement and communication. So workers will sometimes ask, when you ask workers what happened in terms of engagement, they'll tell you about a very complicated PowerPoint presentation that they got 6 months before decommissioning. So do we consider that to be adequate communication? As well as community members saying they saw a notice somewhere as Paza shop talking about the decommissioning of the power station. So these are the issues that were problematic. We can definitely note that economic development and diversification outside of just the establishment of projects was an issue of concern, as well as just the lack of institutional arrangement. So looking at Eskom to deliver a just transition is not probably the way to go about it, because this requires active involvement of other stakeholders that are broader than just Eskom, considering that Eskom has a very defined business model. And then, of course, financial arrangements. All of this is going to cost money, and those things need to be identified and figured out well before the decision comes about to decommission. So, having seen all of these challenges in real time, um, there there's a common understanding that, there's a commitment to transition, there's an intent to transition, but there's always a challenge if there aren't rules for the game and standard rules, so that they can be applied, um, they can be applied in various other contexts, and that the various other partners understand what those rules are, and as well as norms and standards. So from this experience, this really necessitated for the need for there to be norms and standards, as well as codes of good practice that can govern this process, so that when the next decommissioning process takes place, it's clear from the onset what rules are in place to govern the process, so that it ends up being more equitable in nature. Another process that was taking place, that was really good to reflect on as well, is the labor law reform that was taking place here in NADLAC. One of the areas that was discussed in that process was around climate proofing labor law. This is important in the sense that, from a law point of view, or labor law point of view, there wasn't really an intersection between climate law as well as the labor law. And now we're starting to realize, especially when we take into consideration issues related to extreme weather events and increased heat, this interaction needs to come closer together. So couple of professors from the University of Western Cape came together to draft a policy document for the NADLAC constituencies. And one of the recommendations was around the development of a code of good practice around the just transition, which is what we are trying to get going with this process, and having discussions with the various social partners to see what form this would be able to take. Now, what is a code of good practice, and what can it do really? So in a nutshell, it's a practical tool. And what this practical tool will help us do is translate just transition principles that are sometimes very broad in nature and open to interpretation into specific operational norms. This will support government, employers, as well as workers in managing the transition in the workplace. At the level of the community, it will enable regulators and civil society to monitor compliance, but most importantly, it'll build much needed confidence among workers and communities that have felt that they've been left behind. So if we were to go to Komati today, I think there is a large cohort of community members there who feel like they've been a victim of this transition. And this happened because a lot of us went into a process not understanding what we needed to put as the necessary safeguards to ensure that we indeed leave nobody behind. So that, in a nutshell, is what we're looking at in terms of a background and context. And just to state, we do really need guidance and inputs from yourselves. The last two stakeholder roundtable discussions have been quite critical in helping us reshape our thinking around a code of good practice. And maybe let me just say this. This is not an exercise to create more regulatory burdens, or to make it difficult to do business in this country. No, no, it really isn't. But what it does help us do is it helps us create certainty. It helps us harmonize, particularly the labor market. And it creates some sort it creates, again, like I said, some sort of regulatory certainty, policy certainty that helps us determine what needs to happen and when does that need to happen. And usually when those rules have been put in place, what you find is that you don't have the level of pushback that you have, and the process towards our just transition journey to a low carbon economy happens at a seamless level. But most importantly, it's also meant to provide tangible sort of impacts from the transition to communities, workers that need them the most. So that's me in terms of a brief background and setting of context. I'm now going to hand over to Jens, who will then give us a just transition framing from the side of the ILO.
All right. Thank you very much, Lebohang, for that very nice introduction. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming despite the rain. So my name is Jens Dyring Christensen. I represent the International Labour Organization here. And I'm just going to try to put us into sort of a frame of mind. What are we talking about when we talk about just transition? And in South Africa, I think many of you are more familiar with sort of the term just energy transition. But I think the point is this is much broader than just energy when we look at just transition. I just want to quickly alert you to some of the logos there on the slide. So International Labour Organization, just a very, very quick brief on what is the ILO. The ILO is a United Nations specialized agency. We were formed in 1919 as part of the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles that ended the First World War because it was felt that the world needed a global organization that globally could foster global collaboration in the world of work, set labor standards, making sure that people are not subjected to indecent and undignified work. So that's where the whole concept of decent work come from. I think what's important and also why we're here in the NETLAC chamber is that the ILO is a tripartite agency. So the only UN tripartite agency. So when a country is a member of the ILO, it's not only government, but it's also organized business, organized labor. So business and employers organizations and trade unions. And I think this is very important because ILO is setting global standards, international labor standards, and the whole work around just transition fits into this global body of international labor standards. I mean, no child labor, respect for fundamental principles and rights at work, right to equal pay for equal remuneration for the same type of pay between men and women and so on and so forth. So I think this is important because what we are discussing here today in terms of just transition, this is guidelines that have been developed by the International Labour Organization. So this is the organization, so the member states, 187 countries are currently a member of the ILO, and they meet annually in Geneva at the International Labour Conference, and then they set these and decide on these international labour standards. Then you have another, you all know the PCC, but then you have another logo there at the bottom that says PAGE, Partnership for Action on Green Economy. This is a UN joint program that is working with PCC in South Africa to advance green economy. And in the context of this phase of the PAGE program, we are focusing on a just transition. And it is 5 UN agencies. So in addition to the ILO, which is coordinating PAGE in South Africa, it is also United Nations Development Program. It is United Nations Industrial Development Organization. It's a United Nations Institute for Training and Research, and it is the United Nations Environmental Program. So just that as a background. So why are we here and what I'll speak for about 10, 15 minutes, I think. I want to just focus on three areas. What are we talking about when we talk about just transition? Why is this important? And in this context, climate change and environmental challenges. I will tell you a bit about what is the ILO Just Transition Guidelines and the international labor conclusions on a just transition. And then just a few reflections of a whole of society approach and the critical role of social dialogue and tripartite dialogue. And not to bore you with the numbers, but we all know, South Africa's economy is very coal reliant. 80% of coal of electricity is coming from coal. We see incredibly high levels of youth unemployment and youth unemployment. We see extreme income inequality, and we also see that South Africa gradually is losing its competitiveness towards other developing and emerging economies. So when it comes to climate change and just transition, just very quickly, what are we talking about? And I mean, just to remind us, I think we all know this, and 99% of the world's global and leading climate scientists, they agree that the climate is changing, the environment is changing, and it is because of human activity. The way we produce our goods and services, global transport, global supply chains. And that is one of the defining challenges of the 21st century. So we see that human activity, by burning of fossil fuel, coal, oil, gas, produce these heat trapping gases in the atmosphere that actually results in this global warming. And of course, you have climate change denialists and skeptics, and certain countries have a political motivation as opposed to others. But the science is pretty clear, and we do see the changes taking place with resource depletion, acidifying of the world's ocean, biodiversity loss, and droughts, but also heavy rainfalls in certain areas, like we've just seen recently in the Kruger. Excuse me. So the bottom line is that our current economic model of production and consumption, it's not sustainable, right? And it's not because we say that coal is bad or oil is bad or gas is bad. We need to realize that the discovery of oil and coal, excuse me, and the technologies, the internal combustion engine, how we are driving our economies has been possible because of the use of fossil fuels. But I think the world now is at a tipping point where we have to say this is no longer sustainable. Something has to change, and we need to find a way to remodel our economy, how we produce, how we consume, so we don't let these gases into the world's atmosphere, right? So it's not it does not need to be an ideological debate. Do you believe in climate change or not? The fact is, it's here, and it is having consequences on the world of work. I think that's the point. So what we see because of this change and because of global climate commitments by countries across the world, that there is a commitment also in South Africa to phase out or phase down in South Africa coal. In many other countries, you already see they are much further ahead. But what we'll see is that there will be job losses in some of these sectors, right? And the International Energy Agency is expecting 30 million jobs to be lost over the next decade because of fossil fuel phase out. And of course, it happens in countries to different degrees and at different pace. In South Africa, the government has said, we are so dependent on coal that coal is going to be part of our energy mix for the next decades and many decades. But they've also committed we must phase out, right? So just some figures, but then I think also important to see it as an opportunity, and there is a positive narrative that as we are embarking on this just transition, we can create new jobs, we can create new economic opportunities, we can create local economic development in previously marginalized regions. And if you look at economic growth in 2023 alone, investment into clean energy sectors grew 10% of global GDP. So it's not insignificant, right? If you look at jobs in the energy sector. We see in clean energy sector, and clean energy actually includes nuclear, because in terms of emissions, it's actually a clean source of energy. The problem with nuclear is the radioactive waste that need to be disposed of and stored, safely and securely. Huh? But clean energy jobs in 2023 was 35 million jobs, and 30 million of those was actually in renewable energy. So, solar, wind, and so on and so forth. And but what we also see happening, and Lebo spoke about a bit about this, the tangible benefits. We see what we call geographical and temporal disconnection. So I'm just going to come back to that just in a moment, what that means. So what is a just transition? So a just transition is to meet the climate ambition and the environmental goals that we see in the Paris Climate Agreement, and we see in those decisions that are being made by the Conference of the Parties when they meet. But at the same time, we need to deliver social justice and decent work at the same time, right? So it's meeting climate goals, but also delivering jobs and economic growth. That is what we call just transition. Now, moving on, the last few days I've been told I've been speaking too much, so I'm trying to make this short, right? So we can ask questions after. So ILO, just a bit of history, and I've made this very short. There's a lot of more history behind this, but the first time the world really started talking about climate change was in 1972, when the first UN Conference on Human Environment. And that's also the time when the United Nations Environmental Agency was created. And then there's been different sort of milestones since then. The International Panel on Climate Change was established in 1988. This is the leading climate scientists that are producing these annual reports about how is the climate changing. Then in 92 we had the UNFCCC. So this is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. A lot of acronyms. And this is the one, if you're not familiar, but this is, if you've heard of the COP, the Conference of the Parties, this is where they meet, this is where they report to, this is where the South African government is reporting to UNFCCC on their national determined contributions and so on and so forth. Then in 2015, the Paris Agreement was adopted at COP21 in Paris, and they also make a lot of reference to just transition, realizing that it's not just about the climate. It's not just about the environment. It's also about social benefits, jobs, economic growth. And then in 2015 as well, the ILO developed these guidelines on a just transition, and there was an international labor conference on just transition where 187 member states, including South Africa, government, business, labor in South Africa, endorsed this resolution. So this is now becoming guiding principles for any member state of the ILO. And that's also why we're having this discussion here today, and why the ILO is supporting PCC. So what is this framework and just transition talking about? It talks about the what and the how. So you see the dark blue color and the lighter blue, less dark blue in the left-hand corner. So the what is, we need to promote inclusive, sustainable, job-rich economic growth. We need to make sure we ensure social justice, social equity, but we also need to find a way to manage the process, because it's complex, right? How do you remodel and make this systemic change across economies? So it's about managing the process, and it's about financing the process. And here countries are, of course, at very different starting points. We know in South Africa there's not a lot of fiscal space to invest in many of these climate goals, so that's an issue. But what it's also saying is there needs to be a stronger focus on policy coherence and coordination. So what you see up there are different policy areas, from macroeconomic policies and growth policies, industrial policies, enterprise policies, skills and education, occupational health and safety, social protection, and so on and so forth. But there needs to be a much stronger coordination between ministries and departments and agencies that are working in these areas. And we know in South Africa, there's a lot of compartmentalization, there's a lot of siloed approach, and that's also why President Ramaphosa established PCC, so PCC could coordinate across many of these government departments. And if you look at the slide there, it's about making sure that when National Treasury, identifies what is the fiscal space for social spending, and in an investment, when they set the rates, how does this actually foster sort of an enabling environment for driving a just transition and green economy? When DTIC look at their industrial policies and the type of programs they support, are they keeping supporting coal development or fossil fuel development or extraction, or are they trying to invest in programs and projects that are actually enabling the green economy? When we look at, I won't go through all of them, but we look at skills and lifelong learning and the whole education system. Is the education system all the way from primary education, secondary education, vocational technical training, academic institutions, are they actually putting in place courses and that gives young people the competencies to work in the green economy when they enter the labor market from education, right? And of course, social dialogue and collective bargaining is super, super important. I won't go through all of these, but so just to try to summarize a bit. So when we talk about a just transition, we talk about a whole of society approach. It's not only about environment. It doesn't rest with DFFE, Department for Fisheries, Forestry and Environment. It's not just about, employment and labor. It doesn't rest only with Department of Employment and Labor. It's not just about industrial development and enterprise development. Therefore, it doesn't only rest with DTIC or DSBD, right? There has to be coordination and collaboration across these sectors. That's why PCC has this mandate from the president to convene stakeholders across these different sectors of the economy. And action is needed at many, many different levels. So at the global level, if you look from below and up, this is where we see the global climate commitments. South Africa being signatory to the Paris Agreement, reporting every 5 years with its national determined contributions and how it's going to mitigate emissions and how it's going to adapt, reporting to the UNFCCC. But it's also at the national level. What happens in Mpumalanga as opposed to Eastern Cape, as opposed to Northern Cape, right? So how can, at the national level, how can the national government work with provincial governments to put programs in place? But then also at company level, and I think this is super important. We see a lot of pushback from the business community saying, this is going to be too expensive. We cannot, make sure that our factories enter into what we call cleaner production and better resource efficiency, unless there are government incentives, there are government support in place, there are government schemes in place. So to what extent is, for instance, DTIC and Productivity SA and perhaps NIDA and others that are supporting enterprise growth and development, how are they actually enabling that investment in a green economy and a just transition, right? So it's a whole of society approach. As I said, it's economy-wide, but there are very sector-specific challenges. Yesterday, we heard a presentation from Son Levin from TIPS talking about how it's not just energy, it is metal groups. It's how we produce steel. It's agriculture that is impacted. It's tourism that is impacted. We see the devastating rains in Kruger and the severe drop in tourism into the Kruger Park, right? It's so different sectors face unique risk, and there has to be different mitigation strategies put in place. But then we also see what we call geographical disconnection. So the benefits of climate action or economic transaction might happen in one place, but the effects are felt in another. So for instance, all the coal mines in Mpumalanga province, the 1.2 million that are living in coal towns in Mpumalanga, when those power plants like Komati is slowly and mining is slowly over the next decades is being phased out, the new economic opportunities might not happen in the same place. They might happen in other places, in Eastern Cape and in Northern Cape with windmill parks, for instance, right? So this is what we call geographical disconnection. So how can we make sure, or how can the South African government make sure that when, these geographical disconnections happen, that let's say old power plants can be repurposed for something else, for other economic activities, or how can the economy in a former very much reliant coal town be diversified to look at new economic opportunities. But then we also look at temporal disconnections. And I just want to explain this term. That is that the cost of transition are immediate. So a co-worker who is losing his or her job will feel it immediately. But the benefits of then new investments in different places and the investment reskilling and upskilling of perhaps young people or a co-worker to get a new job will take longer time, right? So some people feel the immediate effect, but they will see the benefits materialize later. And I think this is, as Lebo said, the tangible benefits are perhaps not immediate, right? And then what we see, of course, is this risk and vulnerability is highest among people living in poverty. People that are already vulnerable, people that are already marginalized will feel much harder this the effects of that transition process. The whole purpose of Just is that it has to be inclusive, it has to be fair, it has to be with the community, business representative, trade unions sitting at the table, having a seat at the table, being able to influence the decisions. That's also why we have sessions like this, right? And my last slide is just very quickly around the importance of social and tripartite dialogue, because these things are the investments that needs to happen in the green economy and in renewable energy and moving to a low carbon economy cannot happen by government decisions alone. It cannot happen by businesses making decisions alone. There has to be social consensus. And part of that social consensus is social dialogue. And as Lebo said, many communities already feel left behind, like in the decommissioning of the Komati power station, which is an important lesson learned for South Africa, where people were not consulted. Uh, uh, they were not told early enough. Strategies were not put in place to actually diversify the economy to create more jobs. So we need, and when we talk about social dialogue, it's a whole of society approach. So it's community organizations, it's youth organizations, like the young people that Hadle there from NIDA represents. That do they have a seat at the table? Are they involved? Can they make their voice? But it's also tripartite dialogue, which is, the very strong dialogue that takes place right here in this chamber between organized business, between government, and between trade unions in South Africa. But that in itself, tripartite dialogue is not enough in itself, because the majority of workers in South Africa are actually not organized. They work in the informal economy. So that's it. Lebo, back to you. I hope this was short enough today.
Thank you very much, Jens. I really appreciate the outline as well as the framing. It's really helpful to kind of get us back to the core of what we mean around the just transition, because it's been open to interpretation, so it's always good to come back to some of the fundamentals. I just want to check, is Harun online?
Yes, I'm here, Lebo.
All right. We started late, so I don't want to hold you even more. So I'm gonna ask you to come in with your presentation, Harun, and then after that we'll take questions and inputs from my presentation, what Jens would have talked about in his framing together with Harun's presentation. So Harun, I'm gonna hand over to you. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Lebo. I'm just trying to close a whole lot of windows because I couldn't find. Um, just give me 1 second. Sorry. Let me try again. Okay, I found it. Okay. Lebo, can you tell me if you can see this? I'll put it in presentation mode.
Okay, we can see it.
Okay. Excellent. So this is part of ongoing work with Francois Steenkamp, who he's on the call. And can come in at any time, of course. With respect to this clutch of work that we're doing around the just transition, Lebo actually heard a version of this presentation at the AFD meeting in Paris. So apologies, Lebo, you're going to hear it again. In many ways, uh, what I'm going to try and do in the presentation is actually a combination of probably two, maybe even three papers that we've produced around the just transition and focused purely on coal. What I'm going to try and do is, in essence, um, give you what we think in the work that Francois and I did, and Francois led most of the work, a roadmap for thinking practically through uh, the levers and the design elements of a possible just transition package for coal workers. And we've sort of stepped a little bit out of our comfort zone in actually trying to provide a policy matrix approach, as it were, to understanding coal workers, and we then go a step further and look at institutions that may provide for the just transition as well as costing. Okay, so that's a bit of a mouthful, but the focus of the just transition program or any just transition consideration, of course, I don't need to tell this audience, is of course the coal mining industry. Well known is that 83% of all operating coal mines in the country are in Mpumalanga. Um, and if you think that that's a biased estimate in terms of coal production, those 83% of coal mines also account for 80% of total coal production. So in many ways, not only are the employers, but also the production base of coal are concentrated or is concentrated in a single province. And in fact, the detailed work we've done will show that it's within a few district councils within the province as well. You also see, which is not unimportant for the just transition discussion, is that it's a five mining company story. You've got them, whether it's Seriti, Sasol, Exxaro, Tugela, and Glencore, accounting again for close to 80% of all coal production. So if you like, the employers around which we need to have an engagement with, or who need to be at the table for just transition, are also fairly narrow based. They're not dispersed, they're not small businesses, um, they're not sort of regionally distributed around the country and so on. Of course, coal moves beyond in terms of the value chain, but based on our early estimates, again, as I say, that's in our first paper, about 76,000 jobs is the count we have for direct coal jobs. When you include direct and indirect employment, so if you start looking at utility employment, namely Eskom and a little bit of downstream activity in chemicals and so on, you get to about 100,000 jobs that represent about 0.5%, make it 0.6% of total employment in South Africa. But the core of the just transition challenge, if you like, in a direct first order sense, if you think of coal, it would be those 66,000 workers in the coal industry in Mpumalanga. Now, what we have tried to do is think of what are the empirical devices, or if you like, the descriptors you need for a coal employee to start a conversation, to start a planning, to start a design for a just transition package. And in many ways, um, it's really about figuring out what's the occupation, education, and age of co-workers, because arguably that's how you can begin to design very specific, tailored, just transition responses. And we'll get a little bit. We'll get to that in a little bit. But here's the first take. So if you look at coal employment, in this table, I've got coal employment by occupation and education, right? And what we do then is, if you look at the bottom figure, if you can see my cursor, there's the 66,000 workers there at the bottom, right? And so we ask the question, how are they distributed by education, which is the columns, versus occupations, which are the rows? And you end up with what we would call, right? So maybe if I start with the red rectangle, if you think of elementary workers, they number 4,754 workers, right, in the coal industry, according to our data. All right. That's about 7% of the Mpumalanga coal workforce. We would argue, right, that we call them the core of the the just transition challenge because these are workers who have low levels of education, right? And low levels of skills, if you like, and the likelihood of finding employment is very low. But that's not the only category of worker that you should be interested in and therefore tailoring your just transition response to. You also have in the blue rectangle, right? So this one here, you have a whole bunch of workers that have diplomas or degrees, right? And so we would argue they're not low skilled, clearly, right? And their number about 17,000 workers, or 26% of the total, if you add all of this up here. And we would argue that we've called it a minimal just transition challenge, just a window into how we're thinking, is that they are educated. They have degrees. They could be accountants in XRO, for example. So the just transition challenge cannot be the same for them as it would be for elementary workers. But the rump of workers, the majority of workers are in the green rectangle, right? And these are coal employees with at most complete secondary education, and they're in sort of, let's call it high, but more semi-skilled occupations. They're about two-thirds of all coal workers, about 44,000 workers. They are the core of the just transition challenge. And let's think a little bit about them in terms of a just transition response. Arguably, though, a better way because of the policy responses you can enact to splice the coal workers is to take the same 66,000, take the same occupation breakdown that I've got here in the rows, but this time look at the ages of these workers. What that starts doing is it introduces the idea of early retirees. So you'll see here, based on our data, you've got about 4,000 workers, call it 3,700 workers, 6% of total employment in coal, who are actually between the ages of 55 to 65. These are early retirees. So your just transition response, if you start thinking about this, should take account of the fact, well, maybe the just transition response is early retirement, not necessarily social grants or retraining and so on. And so the age of the co-worker becomes a really important instrument for design of a just transition package. But then, if you take the same sort of logic, elementary workers, so excluding retirees or early retirees, elementary workers from age 15 to 54 are again in our red rectangle here. They number about 4,700 workers. And again, they may need retraining, they may need social assistance, and so on. You then, though, have I'm jumping around a little bit, but you then have the minimal just transition challenge workers, and those are the ones between the ages of 15 to 54 who are in the top three occupations, managers, professionals, and technicians by our division here. And it's critical that one starts thinking about them in terms of job placements or a little bit of top up in reskilling and so on. And we talk to those in terms of our just transition options. Then the purple square would be again what we've called the intermediate just transition challenge, and that should be the major focus of a just transition response, right? 45,000 workers that have that are between the ages of 15 to 54, that have a core level of sort of core skills, but in the semi-skill environment, and they are potentially going to lose their jobs. And you have to think of something a bit more careful than because early retirement won't work and social grants may not be sufficient. Just a quick reference to the fact that coal households matter. So very quickly, what we've done in the previous paper, in the first paper again, is to look at coal households. So our data shows that about 61% of households that have a coal worker have at least one dependent. And so the idea that you are only dealing with coal workers must be dispensed with, and keep in mind that you're looking at two-thirds, close to, well, let's call it 60% of all workers in the coal industry have at least one dependent, if not more. And therefore, vulnerability and poverty levels for coal households, if you like, is a key part of how you design a just transition package. Now, if I go straight to it, right, and you start designing and you think of funding portals, we need to dispense with the idea that the social assistance system that we currently have, so our child support grant, our old age pensions, that they can play any significant part in the just transition response. The answer is they cannot. And the answer is to be found in the graphic here, because if you look at so what the graph presents is the share of the support, so the old age pension, what value is that relative to the median worker, the median wage of a coal worker? It's only 6.5%. The child support grant is 1.6% of the median coal worker's wage. So if you think you're going to run to the child support grant or the SRD or the old age grant or even the expanded public works program to support coal workers, forget about it. The current wages of coal workers, and again, we show actual numbers in other papers, is far too high for the social grant system to take care of part of the funding. It can't do all. None of these can do all of the funding, part of the funding for a just transition. Where do you have to look? Where it starts getting interesting is the UIF, 18% is the value of a sort of possible grant from the UIF within the rules of the scheme to support coal workers. TERS is super interesting because it's 46%, and the compensation fund. So ultimately, when we're thinking about a just transition package in terms of funding and portals of funding, the places we need to start looking for funding or institutional support are those that lie completely outside of, let's call it, our poverty alleviation instruments. It's not in the social grant system. It's not in public works. It all sits in, let's call it those support programs for formal sector workers, compensation fund, TERS, and the UIF. So what do? We run a modeling exercise where we essentially look at the projected employment losses as produced by the JET IP to 2030, right? And we take those losses in coal and we then model what we think could be potential just transition policy responses. And these will unfold in the subsequent slides, but you'll begin to see how we're thinking about a possible policy matrix approach. So first thing is, if you look at the number of jobs lost, this graphic just shows you this is the current time, 2026, it should be 2025, same thing. And then the number of jobs lost will accumulate to about 7,800 jobs lost over the 5-year period, which constitutes about 10% of the coal labor force. That's according to the JET IP. As Francois will continuously remind us, we don't have any other certain estimates. I mean, this could be completely wrong. This could be a lowballing, or it could be a much smaller number, or it could be a much larger number. We don't know. But we take this as our anchor to then do the following. So we take the 7,800 jobs. So now I'm going to go into a little bit of workhorse stuff. So you just follow the logic of what we've done. And we say, these are the 7,800 jobs that are going to be lost. But we know from our description of the coal labor market that this is the distribution of these workers by age. And we break it down into 3 age categories: youth, middle age, and near retirement, and 3 occupational categories: skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled, right? And so the idea is these buckets of workers, right, in this 9 grid, let's call it, right? So you're either skilled and youth, or skilled in middle age, or skilled in near retirement. You're either semi-skilled in youth, and so on, right? So when you are put into a bucket, we would arguably say we have 3 age groups, 3 skills groups that allow us to begin to design a logical just transition policy package. So if you hold on to that idea, right, because we'll come back to those buckets, we would argue that there are possibly 4 big instruments, or 3 big instruments, that you can use in designing a just transition policy. The first is income support, right? So that's the obvious. So that's, a grant in essence, right? And it can be time bound, right? And it can be a share of the wage, and the share and the duration can vary, right? So and hence the notion that you can get a big income support package for co-workers that lose their jobs. That could be 5 years, or you could get a big one, sorry, a smaller one that lasts only a year. You could also vary the share of the wage, right? So hence the key point that you could pay 50% of the wage, or you could pay 80% of the wage. And you could cover it for 5 years, or you cover it for 1 year. So there are lots of different levers and sub levers that you could use, and often they're going to be arguably the subject of negotiations, or even the subject of budget constraints. You would also, very importantly, why age matters as our categorization is that arguably you do not want to provide a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old coal worker with a income grant for life or for 5 years, right? But you may want to do it for a 60-year-old. I'm just sort of playing with numbers, right? A 60-year-old coal worker. So the duration and the intensity, the level of support through a grant system will depend very much on the age of the co-worker, arguably. The second big instrument you have is education and training, right? And the education and training um, uh, uh, package is around reskilling for realistic destination jobs. And again, current work that we're doing is literally about trying to find matching jobs that co-workers could go into in a more careful way. But you can think of, for example, do you retrain a worker through a 1-year postgrad engineering diploma, or do you go for longer 3-year apprenticeship positions for these semi-skilled workers? So education and training is the second instrument. The third is the one we've referred to earlier for the 55 plus workers, is offer these workers early retirement packages. The fourth is mobility assistance. If you're a highly skilled worker, arguably you're not going to need a social grant, but you may need help moving as an accountant from Mpumalanga to the Northern Cape, right? And so job matching and sort of relocation costs may be covered. So in each of these four, sorry for the maths level, but in each of these four um, packages, we are suggesting mechanisms for how we calculate the support. So in the temporary income support package, you either going to change the share, so how much of the wage are you supporting, right? And how long are you supporting? And who are you giving it to? You're only giving it to old workers, and are you giving them 50% or 80%, and for how long? 1 year or 3 years or 5 years. We then have a way of calculating education and training support. We have a way of calculating early retirement. Sorry, I'm just looking at my time. And we have a way of calculating mobility assistance. I'm happy to go back with Francois here to the assumptions and how we came up with the numbers and so on. But those are embedded in our assumptions, which very crucially, if I just go back, you can change these, right? So you can say, yeah, but give me a policy proposal which says you're going to give me a grant only for a year, only for 30 plus aged workers, and only valued at 30% of the wage. Now do the calculation for me. So, but we have to choose those for you, and that's what we've done in these simulations. But we don't know what the policy position is. We don't know what unions and coal mines have decided, or government is going to be the chosen just transition policy matrix or policy option, because it hasn't been decided on. So we provide what we call 6 packages, right? And these are the 6 packages we came up with. They're not the only ones, of course. You can change them. You can throw all of them out and come up with 5 other new ones, or you can combine them. The first package is what is called the universal transition payment. It's a very simple, right, package which says we're going to cover 1 year's of wage for every cohort, right? For everybody in those grids, semi-skilled, unskilled, skilled, young, old, and so on, for 1 year, and we're going to pay 100% of your wage. It's simple, it's clean, and you go in and you go out. So you give 100% of the wage for 1 year for all workers, done. That's the Just Transition Package 1. Just Transition Package 2 is the big grant one. It scales it up. It says 100% of the wage, right? For all workers except the early retirees, we're going to give you 100% of the wage for 5 years. And then we're going to, what we're going to do is fund early retirement for older workers. And then we move into 3, 4, 5, 6, which start getting a bit more complex because I've only now used, remember for my instruments, I've only used now the first two in these first two packages. But what about education and training and mobility assistance? I've given you a little bit of early retirement, but let me make it more sophisticated. So the tailored approach does the following. That's package 3. It says early retirement, 55 plus, mobility assistance if you're skilled, youth or middle age. For those who are semi and unskilled, youth and middle age, in other words, not retirees, we give you training, right? And we combine the training with limited income support. So we give you some sort of transition, right? To find work, to train. While you're training, you get some kind of income support, right? And then the durations are aligned to the training spells. Okay, and then we've got those percentages. Just Transition Package 4 is similar to 3, right? But you start changing the magnitude and the duration, right, in terms of benefit intensity and in terms of the duration of the grants and the training spells you'll support and so on. Just Transition Package 5, tighter targeting, shorter durations, and exclusions for some middle-aged unskilled training slots, and that's the most frugal design after Package 1. Now, and then Just Transition Package 6 is the early retirement one. It's more about reattachment for older workers. So it gives you Just Transition Package 3, except the retirement age is lowered from 55 to 45. These are just, I mean, what I'm hoping you're seeing is not trying to remember every single scheme and every single difference. Is just see how we've changed the levers based on the principles, right? So maybe you want to go hard on retraining, and then you force almost everybody except early retirees to find a job, and therefore you lower the social grants, or you want to go pure incentives like pure support, and then you ramp up the income support, and you do very little in terms of training. So you can think of these as the following type of system, and I've just given you the package 1, and I think I've given you the next one as well, just as a way to think about this as a policy matrix that you can switch on and off using different levers. So if you recall here, and this is very critical almost in a visual sense to think about the policy matrix package. If you think of our four policies, we've got early retirement, mobility assistance, education and training, and temporary income support, right? And then over here in the first two columns, you've got the skill and the age, right? And we told you we've got three age categories and 3 skill categories. In this universal transition payment, all of these other policies, retirement, mobility assistance, education, and training are off. They're zero. You're not giving this at all, right? The only thing you're switching on, which is the 1, so 1 is on and 0 is off. The only thing you're switching on is temporary income support for everybody. That's our package 1. And what are you giving them? You're giving them a full share, so they're getting their wage, right? And you're giving it for a year. So in that very notion, the most simplest form, you can begin to see, you say, well, yeah, but this is too simple. I want to actually give mobility assistance to youth who are skilled or semi-skilled, and some education and training to even the retirees and so on. Once you start doing that, you can play with so many different permutations of a just transition policy package. And if this sounds like it can be made much more sophisticated, it can be. At the moment, it is an Excel spreadsheet where we only have these options, but you can think of something far more sophisticated in the form of even an app that can be built. Here's the package 3. So I'm not going to give you all of them. Package 3 is the one that says, oh, hang on. we're not just going to give temporary income support, we're going to give mobility assistance. You see, it's gone on. For young people, we're giving them mobility assistance. For the middle-aged, we're giving them mobility assistance, but only for the skilled, remember, because they can find jobs. The rest don't get mobility assistance. What about early retirement? Yes, it goes on, but obviously only for those that are near retirement. Those are the ones. Temporary income support happens, but only for the semi-skilled and the unskilled. How much is paid? Well, 50% of the wage is paid for youth and more for the middle-aged because they probably have dependents, they probably have higher costs and so on. 60% of the wage is covered for the semi-skilled who are middle-aged. But if you're middle-aged and unskilled, we'll give you even more, 80%. And how long? 3 years versus 5 years, and so on. And so these little equations we have here become the key levers that you can start changing. And so in the limit, what you get is this type of system where you can switch a variety of policies on and off depending on the design, the principles that you establish, and of course, very crucially, the cost. And speaking of which, the cost does matter, right? So when we take our 6 packages, because these are the ones that we designed, because you've got to start somewhere, you find that the estimates so again, remember it's our 7,000 employment loss. So the 10% employment loss model, right? Just Transition Package 2, remember, is the big grant. It's a complete outlier. That's when you're covering 100% of the wage of all these coal workers, cost 10 billion rand. As Treasury has said, please note that this is indicative. This is not affordable, right? But it just gives you a sense of you cannot think of this as a big grant route. It's just not affordable, right? And if you think you've got the CSG or the SRD, I showed you earlier, it's meaningless, right? It's 1% of the wage of a coal worker. Doesn't feature. So you have to start thinking of, let's call it packages 1 and then 3 through 6. And here you begin to see numbers, right, where they range from between 2 to about 4 billion in total cost over the period. And if we start playing with the numbers, and then I'll just run through these very quickly as I run out of time. What do they look like in terms of, so these are big numbers, but what do they look like in terms of relative fiscal cost? The big grant policy package means you're going to take away 3% of South Africa's total national social protection expenditure only for 7,000 coal workers. So the idea that you suddenly have a campaign to eat into your social protection budget, I can tell you now, that's very unlikely to succeed just because of the number of beneficiaries you will be taking grant money away from. Almost all of the other policy packages, they come in just as a sense of the relative value, come in at about 1.6% of the total social protection budget. But it's very unlikely that the fiscus can and should bear the cost alone of this just transition. And so one of the questions, Lebo, that we almost have to have, and I raise it all the time, I raised it before, is how can we think about having an engagement with coal mine companies purely if just in terms of the numbers that they have, right, of the workers, the breakdown of workers, so we can get a better estimate of total cost, because these are all based on national estimates from labor force surveys and so on. Which is the big driver in our policy package of spending? It's going to be the temporary income support component, right? You can see in the red bars, which shows which of the instruments we have drive your spending. You see even in the early retirement package, right? Where, of course, the early retirement cost is 30%, but you're still spending 50% of that total package on social grants. So social grant spendings dominate, followed by education and training because they are repeat costs over a number of years. And then retirement obviously varies depending on the package choice you have. So, and I think I'm almost done, Lebo. So one of the things that you have to start being deliberate about, and again, you'll see that I'm hoping what we've done is to lay a design platform around which you can start tweaking and thinking through different options. But one of the things we started thinking about, but I think you need far more careful administrative data, financial statements from these different institutions to get a sense of what's affordable. So for each policy instrument, there is a natural funder. So for example, you've got the UIF, you've got TERS, you've got the CETAs, and so on. So if we take, for example, the universal transition payment, so that's our social grant package, the required is 2.2 billion, which was in that earlier table. And what's accessible based on the rules, right, of the UIF is 625 million, leaving you a gap of 1.6 billion, right? And you can run through each of these to see the total funding gap, right? So, for example, if you go education and training, where we've suggested that the CETA could be the first port of call, right? But again, the CETA can only support those who are coal workers. They can't sort of take the entire budget and support the just transition. So you have to look at realistically what can they allocate. You come up with gaps, say, from the CETA funding gaps of about 500 million in the tailored program. For the progressive instrument that we have, or the early retirement, it'll be between 300 and 400 million. Those are just the funding gaps. What's important to note is that the claim counts for the UIF will barely move, right? Because the number of workers is so small, but it would raise the annual UIF spending. That's 600 million on, for example, in the first option, by between 16 and 18% based on the different packages. So the key policy takeaway you have is the existing institutions can participate, and they could probably participate meaningfully in year one of a just transition. But as soon as you get into multi-year allocations, right, it creates unfunded pressures essentially in these programs. And then, so because you've got year one and year two and year three of education and training, you've got early retirement that kicks in and so on. One thing I should say as a footnote here, and comes back to the company's point, is that we have no data on retirement funds and provident funds, and the kind of resources that companies may have, for example, right, in a Section 189 and so on. It's that kind of data that would be really useful to bring into this discussion. So ultimately, I think what we've tried to do is fairly simple. We've given you the size and shape of the coal industry as a starting point. For us, the key descriptors for designing a just transition policy package is to know what the age of the worker is and what their skill is. Because once you do that, you can start designing income support, maybe for unskilled workers, and I'm generalizing, mobility assistance, maybe for those workers that are skilled and can find jobs. So you just aid search, early retirement for those who are old, and then education and training for those whose skills may need to be tweaked to find jobs elsewhere. We then take those, just to summarize what we've done, the logic, we take those and we actually design 6 possible packages. These are not the only 6. What I'm hoping you can see is we've given you a generic model where you can play with options. And what's very, very clear, though, is that the grant system is the driver of costs. That's number one. Number two, we have an institutional makeup, right, that can support the just transition, but there will be significant funding gaps. And so my argument really from here to conclude, Lebo and colleagues, is that one needs to think as the next step of using deliberate administrative data from the actual institutions to figure out, okay, well, what are the potential funding gaps? The mining companies need to tell us what are the actual number of workers, what are the actual skill levels, and the combination of those two, I think, will give us a far more carefully curated just transition policy package. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. That was very detailed. I'm hearing your presentation for the fourth time. And I think I learn something new every time I hear it. So your reflection on the fact that, we currently have current institutions, so UIF, the CETAs, COIDA and other sort of like compensation funds. But when you look at funding beyond year one, you're going to run into challenges, and that's going to create a huge problem for these funds and a big question around can they sustain themselves if they were to take on the responsibility of funding the just transition. What I think is really important, and especially for the creation of this code, is the issue related to disclosures. I know the reason why mining companies don't want to give their data willy-nilly. There's issues related to, issues related to competition, as well as the protection of data. But I think for this to work in a more coherent manner, I think the issues related to disclosures is going to be important. And it's not like it doesn't happen. It does happen during a Section 189. It does happen. So how you safeguard those processes is really important. And just the slide that you put up around the fact that when you look at the current grant systems and the median wages, particularly in the coal sector, is really eye-opening. So the expectation that you could take someone from a permanent livelihood and expect them to rely on the grant system, clearly there's an issue related to how adequate that sort of assumption really is. So thank you for this. This is a really sophisticated empirical evidence that we can use to also inform how we're thinking about the code of good practice. But I just want to check in the room if there are any questions for Haroon, myself, as well as Jens's presentation as well. And when you do make your input, may I request that you please introduce yourself and indicate which organization you are representing here today. So I will start with you.
No, thank you very much. Good morning, and my name is Malebu Mabiti Thompson. I'm from the UIF. My question is a question of principle, Prof. Haroon, that we were talking about a just transition that was going to be paid for in an equitable manner by all involved. And that did not mean the South African government alone. It did not mean pension funds of South African workers alone. It meant that because we are dealing with a global challenge, there will be a global response that will also put money in to assist with the transition. Why is it that in our modeling and our discussions now, that it is the South African public who now have to absorb this, either through loans if it goes via National Treasury, or through their savings or in the UIF and the compensation fund, which are supposed to be their normal insurance for particular points of vulnerability in their working life. That didn't include necessarily this just transition. So I do want to hear why is it that in our narrative, we are losing the international responsibility part when it comes to paying for us to transition in a manner that we understood the just bit of this transition to imply. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miss. Very good question. Who pays and why? May I gather a few more hands, please? Yes.
Greetings to all. My name is Emmanuel Marot. I come from Al Kabulan Foundation, NPC, youth-based organization based in Middelburg. My question will be around these themes of unemployment and reskilling of local young people through the sector of mines since we are shifting from coal to renewable energies. The question that I'm having now as a challenge, in 2022, we have a challenge in Steve that during the time when they were shutting down Komati Power Station, also the mines, the labs that they were closing, they were following. Also during that year, we had an issue where they were addressing about the thing of Optimum coal, the Liberty one, since they were reinstating it again as their opening. The issue is one, whenever these processes are taking place, do they really consider the people to come to them first so that they can talk to them as the people who are in the fence line of the issues? Number two, when they are talking about equitable resources, since 2022, PCC was busy telling us that they are going to support the people, but when we are checking the policies that are being approved, that are being drafted, there are all relatives for the people that are in the back that who are facing the local, the issues of the just transition. And hence that is busy now talking, saying that they are having grants for the people that are going to be removed from their jobs or being transferred. Let me ask, if I'm going to be a farmer around in Mpumalanga, and then I don't have resources, and the people that are helping me with resources, now they are closing. That means I must follow them to Devon or Eastern Cape. And that thing, I think, is going to give us the issue of population, how to control the population. As hence now in Mpumalanga, we are having an issue of population. We don't know how many workers are registered under the mines. We don't know how many mines that are registered fully, that are compliant. And last time when we check, according to our reports under Steve Chwet, the MRE is nowhere to be found because of what we are having 32 mines, but 13 mines are abandoned, no one to talk to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Very good point as well. I see no other hands. Oh, yes, two more. Yeah, okay, let's go there. And then Jens and then Lisa.
Hi, this is Lisa. So I think the issues that Harun raised are very important. And as I think I have indicated in the work that we're doing on the code, one of the things that we want to look at is that methodology of Harun. How can it be also applied in other sectors? But having said that, if we are going to have some methodology, I think there are other questions and issues which need to surface, as part of the methodology. The one issue has already been raised by my colleague, who I understand now is from the UIF, and whether international funding has to be put into the occasion, although I don't know if that's going to happen. But Harun makes a point that there are natural funders. Well, I think we've just heard the UI is not a natural funder. When it comes to SETAs, there are many other pressures on SETAs, including around youth unemployment. That's what SETAs prioritize. And why would SETAs want to prioritize tweaking the reskilling of a middle-aged worker? And then there are also competing priorities. We can't have coal workers exceptionalism, because it might become more urgent to deal with adaptation for agricultural workers. So I think, Harun, I have told you, that I think your work is pioneering, but I think to be able to continue to make traction, it does need to become maybe more nuanced, more pioneering. And obviously that's not for Harun to do. It's actually label for someone like the PCC to do, to say, let's take this as a starting point, but more work has to be done if this thing is not going to almost fall over itself and decampaigned from a number of quarters. But I will come back when I do my presentation about how I think what Harun's work can do can be used in the code. Thanks.
Do I start? Do I just?
Yeah, you
Okay.
can go ahead. Yes. And
Okay,
then we're going to go to Bridget. Did we have anybody on the side? Okay.
Now, just two very quick questions, Professor Borat. Fascinating presentation. I like the numbers and the modeling. Just my first question very quickly. So that 10% employment loss model assumes that anyone will require some sort of assistance. Have you modeled out how many of those of the co-working force would be actually have the right skills, whether they're fully skilled, semi-skilled, to transit into other jobs. I mean, if you have a coal job as a technician, you might be able to transfer or transit into another coal job, because that might actually reduce the numbers, right, or the cost. And then secondly, and thinking about the UIF question, which I think is fascinating, you can argue how is just transition and job losses different from other job losses, right? But is there potentially, it could be interesting also perhaps for you, Libo, to think about, I'm just throwing it out here, to have like a voluntary top-up fund, perhaps to the UIF, where the employee and the employer contributes a bit more, but sets it aside, and this could be for those at-risk sectors like coal and other sectors. Thanks.
Very interesting question. Many years ago, we talked about, is it government employees that contribute? Are government employees covered by UIF? I believe not. No. So that was an interesting sort of innovation that we looked at many years ago around just increasing the amount of money we can get. All right. It was something that was touted as something to help get more resources. Bridget, let's come to you.
Thank you, Harun, for that really comprehensive presentation. And as Lebo says, we learn every day, every time we listen to this economics modeling around the transition. So when the PCC was, just apologies, I'm Bridget Sitshedi from the PCC working in the mitigation team. So when the PCC was doing the consultation for the Just Transition Framework, there was a great call from the communities that we really need to not just look at the workers that are directly employed by the mining houses, and as you presented that there's only a few players that are affected, but there's also the secondary employment of the contract workers, and also just the community itself that benefits from these companies being in the community. And I guess the origin of that is that once you take away the mining companies, then you create the ghost towns, right? So what my question is, I know that the JET office also allocated some of the amount to communities in Mpumalanga. So what I would like to find out is, has that been supported by modeling to find out that, so I see how comprehensive this work has been, looking at the actual employees of the mining companies. So what I would like to find out is has there been some extensive work being done around all the secondary and tertiary employment around these communities? And maybe that it's quite a complex task, but I just want to find out if there has been a call for that. And I think very much linked to what Jens has said, and this is a term that I learned from the work that you do, looking at the product spaces, not just of where to move the affected communities and the secondary employed workers around that area. So it's more of a modeling to support the right allocation of the JET money to everyone else who's not directly employed by the mining companies. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I've got the last question over there.
Thank you. Good morning, Prof. I think my question touches on Bridget's in some
Just
way.
a quick intro.
Yes, thanks, Level. I'm from the National Youth Development Agency, the NYDA. My name is Tlale Matseke. I'm curious about coal workers or young people who aren't coal workers yet, but whose towns and their localities' jobs depend on the coal sector. And so, how do we design for those transitions so that we don't only, think about those that are displaced within their employment status, but then also prevent young people who could be left behind as those local economies shift. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to you, Harun, for some quick reflections.
Yes, thanks very much, Lebo. And I should have apologized for not being there in person. It's just the timing didn't work out. I really would have loved to have been there in person with all of you. Let me jump around a little bit. So the technical question around, does the modeling include transition into other jobs? It's exactly what we did, right? So remember, the mobility assistance instrument takes skilled workers So that's our rule in the model, but you can change the rule. Back to Lisa's point is your own rules, right? Whether it's for the motor industry, whether it's the coal industry, and maybe the codes of good practice require that workshopping, which is to say, well, no, 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 we don't think we want to do mobility assistance, so aiding search for jobs for only skilled workers. We want to do it for semi-skilled workers also, and so on. Our rule was if you were in the top two, top three skill categories, one of the packages offers you mobility assistance, which is we will aid your search for a job and we will pay for your relocation costs. That's all you get. So the assumption built there is people will find jobs in other sectors. I think the question I believe from Bridget around the data is really important. So that's the technical question because all we can do, because we don't have, back to Lebo's point, we don't have the data from the coal industry, right? So, and I'm not sure, it's not clear to me that it's that confidential. If we get anonymized data on the number of workers in your firm by occupation and by wage level, I can't see how that's a competitive edge. And this is a fairly homogeneous industry, right? And so for me, that becomes a critical underpin to move beyond the labor force survey data, which is all we have to actually work with. And then to that last comment around Mpumalanga and regional development, which I think links to the reskilling. So some of the work we are doing slightly separate from this, but adjacent to it, is around understanding the regional economy in Mpumalanga. Because of course, what you are going to get is a regional economic collapse but it's going to be slow. And that's even worse almost, right? Because it's going to be the slow deterioration as we move away in the energy provisioning sector away from coal, you'll see the slow deterioration of these mining towns. There's an attempt in other work to look at what we call economic complexity, to see the comparative advantage that Mpumalanga may have in other sectors. So not just to look at the sectors they have, but to look at their capabilities, as we call it in this literature. So if they have capabilities in certain sectors, in manufacturing, in tourism, and so on, what are the sectors that can deliberately be grown that can then become the target for regional development initiatives? So as was indicated at the end there, that young people actually have opportunities within Mpumalanga beyond coal. I think I sort of picked up on Lisa's point, but I think that's correct, Lisa, that in the codes of good practice, you can replicate it to other sectors, but the rules we designed were our rules. They're not for the scheme. They're not the correct. They're definitely not the correct ones. They may have some logic to it, but sector experts, like Emmanuel who spoke, will tell you, no, we understand the coal sector. These are the better rules. These are the more apt rules with respect to a just transition mechanism. Now, I've saved the best for last because I think Malebo's question is the most important one. For me, the way in which we need to think about this, Malebo, so to be clear, we've put the UIF in according to the rules of the scheme. So none of the rules of the scheme, as per the UIF and the compensation fund, are broken in order to support the just transition. But it is a big ask, you know better than I do, to suddenly ramp up to 7,000 workers like we did during COVID and so on. And so in that sense, even though the rules are intact in the funding according to our estimates, the problem, as you say, is correct in that, and I would nuance it a little bit. I think in what we have done, we have only assumed government is picking up the tab. There's no private sector funding in terms of domestic coal employers, and there needs to be. So there needs to be some participation, even if it's just data that tells us this is what the Provident Fund looks like for coal workers and so on. But in terms of the global response, if there is an attempt to look at financial assistance in the renewable space, then I think part of the deal, and it's how you design such a funding arrangement. I don't think you're going to find a banker willing to give you an extended loan that includes coverage for coal workers for which they're not earning a return. But what can happen is that the government that wants us to buy into the renewables program can offer significant support, say, in education and training. So if they really want us to take their capital, right, to fund our just transition, as in the banking loans and ODAs and so on, well then on the other side you have to guarantee those funding gaps that sit in education and training and retraining of workers and mobility assistance, maybe not income grants because that's right, maybe that's a bit harder because that's fiscal support, but on the retraining and on the mobility assistance we expect the sender government or the creditor government to actually provide some of that support. And I think that's exactly right. I think that's where the redesign of a just transition package, where we're quite careful and curated about what we're asking for in terms of funding the just transition by foreign governments, as it were, is much clearer. As I think at the moment, what will happen is you get the banks coming in and the multilaterals offering all sorts of loans, but nothing in terms of funding the just transition, which I think is exactly your point, where there's coal job destruction and nobody's there to pick up the tab. And I think we have to design instruments to protect ourselves as a country against that. I think I've answered all the questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you for giving us your time and just having this really thought-provoking sort of model that, like Lisa's made the reflection, it's up to the rest of us to replicate it in the other sectors. In fact, I speaking to colleagues in the transport sector, and I'm like, we don't even know what's going on in the transport sector in terms of their profile. As well as just what it's looking like in terms of where workers are and what's their skills profile and their demographics. So you've given us much to think about, and really what I'd like to ask colleagues in the room is that, given the input that we've got from Haroon's presentation, if we can start to think about how this practically starts to influence a code of good practice. And just as a disclaimer, the code of good practice is cross-sectoral in nature, but it's good for us to kind of get our framing from the core sector because a lot of effort and work has gone into that particular sector. So it helps us as a great foundation. So Prof. Haroon, we will get you to come to Joburg at some point, but thank you very much for giving us your time. With that said, colleagues, we are going to break for a tea break, but there is a request before the tea break. There is a request that we come together for a group photo. It's going to be outside the glass doors as you exit the building. You'll be directed by the photographer. I'm going to request that our break be shortened a bit. So that it's only a 20-minute break. So we'll be back at 11:30, seated, ready to take the next presentation. Lisa's going to give us the actual nuts and bolts of what we're thinking in terms of the development of the Code of Good Practice. So please do make yourself available for a picture and then have a tea break, and then we'll be back. Thank you. All right. Okay, colleagues, we are going to get into the nuts and bolts of it. We've done the context setting. We've gone into some of the specific sort of like empirical evidence that exists out there that's helpful to guide how you think about a code of good practice. if you recall from my earlier intervention, I did stipulate that there are things a code of good practice can do, and there are things that it can't. And given the presentation made by Haroon, you can see that in terms of interventions, there's issues more broader than the labor market. So in this session, quite critically, it's important to get your feedback in terms of how do we, in a coordinated manner, put all of these together, right? And again, in my earlier intervention, I indicated that there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of commitments that are flying around in terms of the just transition, but we're just not seeing this embedded, especially at the workplace and community level. So the idea behind a code of good practice is that we can then start to do this. Lisa will get into how that's practically possible. And again, we're looking forward to hear your insights in terms of what can or can't work or what we need to refine our thinking around. The labor session and the civil society session have been really instrumental in helping us think further about this. So I'm going to hand over to Lisa, who will then take us through this next session as we get into the code of good practice. So over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Lebo, and thanks also to the ILO for commissioning myself and my colleague Paul. He will join probably at about 12. I think Lebo has also already explained a lot about the context. What I'll really be doing is putting forward proposals for consideration about how we can enable labor market interventions to support the just transition. And as you can see there, I'll be looking primarily at ones which will enable procedural justice, which is the, procedural justice and distributive justice, and I'll talk more about that. So this morning I saw this picture in the Daily Maverick, so I thought I should just share it with you. But I think it reinforces really the point that Lebo made in the beginning. And Lebo did talk about the problem statement, so I won't really go back there. Yeah, I'll go back here. I'll come straight to the notion of a code of good practice. So I was explaining, I think, to some of the other meetings that when I was 30 years ago, when I was in the Department of Employment and Labor, where I recruited Steve, we were piloting and developing a new labor relations dispensation for post-democracy. And the LRA itself was very innovative in terms of the measures that it introduced. And it introduced the idea that you can't legislate everything, that law creates an enabling framework, and then you've got guidance and codes. And when I was there, at that time, HIV and AIDS was an emerging issue. And one of the things that we did was develop a code of good practice on HIV and AIDS. And now the just transition is an emerging issue. And before we can completely regulate it tightly, having a code which provides guidance is a good thing. But there's also been court judgments and things which have prescribed exactly what a code can do, because a code is guidance. So it is required to guide employers and workers. But the courts have held that a code is binding if the law says you must take it into account. Okay? So there are parts of a code which are binding. However, there are also parts of a code which can't be binding. And I'll give two examples. A code like the Code of Good Practice on dismissal can require an employer to consult. But the code cannot say to the employer, you have to resolve and agree with the the worker and reinstate the worker. The obligation is to consult. Okay, I'll come, so there is a limit to what the code can do. But the other thing is that practical guidance is sometimes very important on its own. There is a code on collective bargaining and picketing. And we know in South Africa that there's been a history of quite violent picketing. So the code says when you picket, you must be 5 meters away. You can't have a stick with, in the picket and things like that. Now that's not, you can't enforce it, but it's good guidance. So there is value in just having guidance. So that's what the code can do. However, a code can't go beyond the legislation. So one of the issues, even, like what Harun was talking about, that we must use the UIF, to have a special dispensation with the UIF. The code can't say that. Only the UIF in legislation can say that. The other thing is that codes are instruments of government to guide employers and workers in terms of the LRA. So it can't say to local government, you have to take over the services that a mine was delivering, the mine sewer plant and so on, when you close down. It can't do that. But it can provide practical guidance to employers and workers that they must go and speak to the local government about the sewer works or the water works or whatever. Another issue which is a bit unclear is that a code is restricted to issues of employment law. So a code can guide what you must do with OSHA and COIDA and UIF within the framework of those laws, and the LRA and the BCA. It's a bit unclear about Skills Development Act, because the Skills Development Act is now gone, and Steve, you might have a view on this, has now gone to the Department of Higher Education. And as we know with the Just Transition, measures on skills are very important. And then the other thing is that, for example, in the DTIC, they pioneered these master plans. Master plan on renewable energy, master plan on steel and metal and steel. Now, those are forums which are non-statutory. So a code, you can give practical advice, but it can't extend. It can't say a master plan forum is makes it a statute. And it also can't involve, all spheres of government or civil society and so on. So because of this, the proposal from working with Lebo and the colleagues from the ILO is that myself and my colleague Paul should draft two things to be negotiated at Medley. Firstly, a code, which can be both binding and practical guidance, but it focuses on employers and workers when they have to consult or do collective bargaining in terms of the LRA. So we stay within the house of the LRA for a binding and practical guidance code. And then we do another document, we're calling it a guidance document, which uses the principles of social dialogue and collective bargaining, but it extends it to other tripartite and multi-stakeholder kind of forums. So, and I'm a veteran here. So again, in our transition to democracy, COSATU had a history of collective bargaining. And then there was a lot of violence all around the country, and there was a peace accord that was signed, especially because of violence in KZN and on the trains and so on with migrant workers. That peace accord was signed by more parties, signed by community organizers and so on, but it took the principles from the union movement on negotiation and mandating and all those things and put it into a non-statutory process. So again, we're in an emerging era. Let's see what we can do with a guidance document. The other thing that we'll do, and this is important for the acting UI commissioner, is that in the research that we've done, and there's a paper that we've already done, you'll see, we've suggested a number of important instruments based on the ILO work. And one of them is some kind of what Harun is talking about, a TERS of some kind. It can't be a TERS because a TERS is temporary, and these may not be temporary, but nevertheless, some instrument. So what we can do is we can just list the instruments, but therefore it will have to be another process in NEDLAC to be able to make those instruments happen. Okay, so that's our suggestion. And it would be important to get feedback from this group, because there's no point in us doing the work and spending this money of the ILO if it's not something that the social partners want. Okay, so again, I keep saying we're trying to go into a new field, so we've tried to have some new definitions of things. Just to clarify, we see a code of good practice and a guidance document as an instrument. The issues that Harun talked about, what did he call them? He called them just transition somethings, programs. What did he call it? Packages. So we're talking about interventions. Okay, that's the wording that we've used in our document. Also, we had a debate. There's many economic transitions. Some that are from climate change, like if the temperature has changed a lot in agriculture, then there's a transition from some crops to other crops or no crops. But there's also AI, Now, are we going to cover everything? And we're saying no. Let this code only worry about environment and climate change. But it's not only coal and mitigation, it's also adaptation, which is important for agriculture and tourism. Okay? And then, as I indicated earlier on, we are going to want to make recommendations about the how, the fairness in processes and procedures, and the what, which is the interventions. And then also, on the other side, you can read it, but there's another scope issue, which is which workers. And we're saying it's all workers, formal, informal, direct, indirect jobs, subcontractors, and so on. But it's not everybody. It's not big business. And it may not even be small business. Okay? Because we've got to draw a line around the set of interventions. But you may want to comment on how we draw that circle around what we discuss and what we don't discuss. Okay. Now, on procedural justice, I don't think I have to explain why it's important, but from the ILO and from trade unions and employers, how do you give effect to procedural justice? It's through social dialogue. And social dialogue, the highest form is negotiation, reaching binding agreements. The less highest is consultation, and the lowest form is information sharing. And again, if you're in the LRA environment, if you organize with the workers and you've got organized employers, you can negotiate. You can have collective bargaining. If you don't have a body that is that you can get a mandate from, a youth organization, a civil society, if it's, and if it's a local government, the best you can do is consultation. What we are suggesting is that the law does say, like even IDPs, but definitely in retrenchments, it says you must consult, But we are suggesting some consultation which is statutory, and then we're also suggesting best practice or additional consultation. And then I'll come to the forums on the next page. Let me go there now. So in the document that we're going to do, we are suggesting that the guidelines that we give will cover sectoral collective bargaining, like CIFSA and what's this motor steel? What is the bargaining council? Sorry? MIBC. As well as non-statutory forums like in the motor industry, and even the Minerals Council is a non-statutory forum, but it's at a sector level. And coal is also like a subsector of a sector. You know, the coal miners, I don't know if they'll do it, but they could set up their own forum. And then obviously the workplace, which is plant level, but also company level. And that's bargaining. Then in terms of retrenchments, workplace consultation is required. And then there's also other workplace consultation that can happen. It is regulated in the LRA and the Workplace Forum, and then in the Mineral Petroleum Resources Development Act, there's a notion of future forums. And then there are also a lot, so that we can put in the code because it's in the LRA family. But on the guidance note, we can still guide tripartite consultation, like probably what happened at Kucha, not Kucha, Kamati, between where employers, workers, and government come together, as well as multi-stakeholders, which can include civil society. Okay, so that's our suggestion. Then what process issues would we want to talk about? The one which, is already quite codified, how you must do your social dialogue, level the playing field, make sure you get mandates, have a facilitator, and so on. What can be bargained and what can be consulted as per the law? What is the best practice? What is the additional? And I think, Lebo, you talked about long notice periods, that by law you only have to give what is it? There's a maximum notice period. But you can, in good practice, tell workers and start to talk to workers 5 years because a plant is going to close down in 5 years' time. You can. It's best practice. Timelines and sequencing. Then this issue of categories of workers is what I was talking about earlier on, is what Harun was saying, is that it would be good in the process to get information from employers and look and see what is the profile of workers. But you must negotiate that with workers. I saw Harun saying maybe you can have early retirement. What did he say? 45. I don't know if workers will ever agree on early retirement 45. Some are still having babies at 45, I mean, so you have to negotiate those categories. So we will provide guidance about thinking about categories. You have to be also gender sensitive. Categories for women workers might be different from categories for male workers. And I also like the point made by somebody earlier on, I think from the NYDA, that you can't only think that workers who are yet to get jobs are also displaced workers. The point that you made about young workers. And it's not a theoretical thing, it's a practical thing. Because young workers in Steve Tshwete, when they were young and still at school, I bet you thought, I'm going to get a job in Kamati. All of a sudden you grow up, you get a degree, and there's no job. That is a displaced worker. The type of the forums, and then the interventions for consultation in multi-stakeholder forums, like the government support, housing services, rehabilitation. Okay, so this is what we are suggesting. These are, must go back. These are the processes, forums, and these are the procedural justice issues. And we'll come back and we want to hear, have we covered everything? Is there more? Now on the distributive justice, these are the interventions. And in the next slide, I've categorized the interventions. Some can happen at a workplace level. Some can happen at a sector level. Some can only require government policy. So now, when you listen to Harun, early retirement, it can happen at workplace, sometimes maybe not, because most pension funds are sectoral, I think he talked about job placement can happen at a workplace level. Sectoral level, early retirement, definitely. But the UIF tours and taking the money from the Mining Qualifications Authority, that's government policy. You know, government must change the policy and then it can be discussed. Or you can discuss at NEDLAC how to change the policy. And then a tripartite forum. So these are the interventions that I'm going to talk about. And you can see what I've done. So like job matching and placement, you can discuss at all 4 levels. But most the income support, UI, labor activation, public employment schemes, you can talk about them in a forum, but you need government policy. So for example, in the Steve Tshwete Municipality Forum, the Steve Tshwete Municipality might run a public employment EPWP. So you can sit in a meeting and say, we want all the children of the people who are going to be retrenched to be the #1 beneficiaries of the EPWP program, you know. But government must first have an EPWP program that you can talk about. But I can tell you, when you go to Steve Tshwete Municipality, I'm sure you can tell me, and you say there is 40% unemployment or 70% unemployment, and you say, let's just negotiate that these young people whose parents are from the company should get first preference. It won't happen. You know, there'll be violence before it happens. So there's always a limit because of the nature of our country. And then if you also look at the interventions, but I'll talk about them more, some are more for the workers and potential workers who are being displaced, and some, and yesterday we got a presentation from TIPS about more what you need to do in the new sectors. So maintaining decent work is very important, because if you look at my co-workers have got pension funds, provident funds, medical aid, permanent employment. But if you go and look at a solar technician, or not solar, you go to wind, when you go set up those big wind turbines, first of all, the wind turbines are made overseas. So yes, there's some jobs, when you come into the country, the truck driver drives the wind turbine to wherever. But that truck driver is a short-term contract, or he's a contractor. Then you set it up. You need very skilled workers. You have workers there to dig some things for maybe 1 month, and then they're gone. So how do you maintain decent work? How do you maintain continuity? Never mind the fact that the wind turbines move everywhere, and every local says, you can't bring a foreign non-local worker into our area. So we might do some guidelines on that. Okay. So these are the interventions that we're suggesting we will put in the code as guidance. And then it will be up to individual sectors or workers to say, yes, this is useful for us to introduce as a just transition intervention. So we talked, I put somewhere there regional job matching. And yesterday in the union meeting, regional job matching. You know, it's giving jobs to Zimbabweans before you give jobs to South Africans. However, in the coal sector, there are skilled jobs. Now, whether we like it or not, Zimbabwe is opening a new coal mine. And should Zimbabwe be training new people to operate the coal mine? Or can there not be that South African workers with coal mines are closing not here, go to Zimbabwe? So it's but in any event, that is something that could be negotiated at a company level. It may not happen, but I'm giving you as example. But at the end of the day, it's something that has to happen on the ground between the affected workers and employers. On skills development, you heard Harun. He says that the SETAs must get involved. I agree. The SETAs should get involved in having some envelope of funds that could be used for the just transition. What do they call it? Demand-led skills development. But if those funds are available, then you have to find a way through the SETA authorities and through the whole skills development plans and the whole bureaucracy of skills to access that money. And what we will do is just provide guidelines about how that can happen. And then the big issue is this thing about skills or tuition allowances. Now, maybe again, the UI TERS or whatever can give, the state can give that money. I think that's a useful thing for employers to give. It's not, as you heard from Haroon, it's not a lot, you know, and it can make a big difference because nobody, a young person or an old person, they can't train and have no food in their tummies. You know, they need to have that allowance. And the other issue also is that it's not a 1 month. Some few reskilling can happen in 1 month. But if you want to reskill, especially for renewable energies, it might be a year, it might be 2 years. So I think that's some guidance that we would give. The income support, very important. Already now, there is severance pay. It's 1 year for every year of service. There are amendments to the labor law. I don't know if Steve will go through 2 years, 2 weeks for every year of service. But again, at a sector level, if workers are powerful, then you can negotiate more. There was another proposal that Stephen's boss tried in the labor law negotiations to get the UI to pay for the second week. For small business. It's not off the table. But this is not what the code can do. The code can just guide. But Stephen, you can bring that in the labor market chamber.
I wanted 4 weeks.
4 weeks. Retirement benefits, I've talked about. UI, I've talked about. Then these training layoff schemes, labor activation, and so on. These, Haroon talked about them. You need to have a special JT TERS or something. It would need to be regulated in terms of Section 5D of the UI. And I was explaining to the acting commissioner that the UI often introduce these schemes and they don't regulate them. And then it's very difficult for social partners to hold the UI accountable to deliver them effectively. So for something as important as the just transition, I think you want to have it regulated effectively. Stephen, I'm sure you'll agree with me. Then, now Haroon said, and he's right at one level, that he calls social protection social assistance. Anyway, that's another technical thing. But he says you can't touch this because it needs to go to the very vulnerable. And that may be true when you're coming looking at coal workers. But now you're looking at agriculture and you want to have a just transition for agricultural workers, many of them who are contract and so on, because the area is flooded or there's a drought. It might just be easier and simpler to give everybody, if you're an agricultural worker or the wife or the child or the granny, a special dispensation, you know? If you think about KZN, how would you, when there were all those floods, how could you say this person deserves assistance and this person doesn't? In the end, the municipality stole the money, you know, for some of the assistance. So, and there is some intellectual studies and all that the most effective way of giving money fairly is through universal social assistance. So it is something we have to think about in the context particularly of adaptation. Again, when you try and target, you spend a lot of money on administration. And there's lots of opportunities for fraud and corruption. Why is there so much fraud and corruption in home affairs? Is because you have to meet certain criteria. You know, you have to prove your child is born in South Africa. So you make a fraudulent way of making sure your child is born in South Africa. Okay. So I think we do need to think about it in not so much in the code, but in the guidance note. And this is really for a guidance note. Yesterday we heard from Saul from TIPS that we mustn't talk about economic development and so on. We must talk about economic diversification. I think he's right. And the ILO are very strong on not just any enterprises, but sustainable enterprises. You know, I think here, there's lots, there are a lot of government support things, but what we should provide guidance about is how do employers and workers and government negotiate together to get what is best. And, Renee was saying to me earlier on that unions often don't access proper research. And often what happens in these communities, and I'll give an example. Okay, let me know, it's a bit too close to home. Let me give that you'll find a small town, and then somebody will come from China or someone will come from India, etc., and say, hey, which is also what happened in Newcastle with the textile workers. Wine and dine the councillors. They will get free land, or they'll get land at they build factories there. They say we're going to give lots of jobs to your workers. Before there's no jobs to those workers. They bring the workers in from Lesotho and they put them in slave factories and things like that. But you don't have to have that. But somebody will say, we're going to give lots of jobs. They get the government incentives, and then they don't create the jobs that they promise. And that's why what we'd like to do is to provide guidance to make sure that workers and employers negotiate these things, are consulted, and they are informed. And I was saying to Lebo that the PCC have done a very nice document about short-term opportunities in the manufacturing sector, for short-term manufacturing opportunities in Mpumalanga. And they've really, it was a consulting company, a fancy consulting company. I'm sure you paid a lot of money. But still, they looked and they said, in forestry, these are the risks, these are the opportunities. And even to the extent that you mustn't go for these trees, rather go for these trees. You need to have a detailed plan. You can't just jump at the first opportunity. And then again, I think I've already talked about this, about maintaining decent work. The big issue here for the code, or in the labor relations environment, is those definitions, Stephen, that must come from the labor law amendments, so that the definition of an employee is broader, even in terms of retrenchments. At the moment, the definition of employer doesn't cover retrenchment obligations in terms of Section 189 and 189A, and also doesn't cover them for being able to get UI money. I saw in the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan that they have got a nice commitment to decent work, which is very important for wind and solar and so on. But how do you make it go beyond a commitment? So we might look at some guidelines on that. Okay, then the last one is restoration, rehabilitation, and resilience. Now, again, NEMA creates lots of obligations. This is what mines have to do. Now, you ask the DMRE, how many mines do this? They don't do it. And why don't they do it often? Because by the time the mine is closing down, they are poor. They've got no money, which is wrong. And I even know there's, I think, a fund that you're meant to put money into to make sure that you have the money, but it doesn't happen. So we might put some guidelines. It's not foolproof about what workers and employers must do to insist that this is done. And also bearing in mind that remediation projects offer short-term jobs or transitional jobs. So it can be part of a plan. I'm thinking now I don't know what's happening in Newcastle now. ArcelorMittal closed its company down in September. I know they were getting TERS money until February. Could those workers have been using the TERS money, and maybe they are doing closing down activities, maybe they're not, I don't know what they're doing. The other issue, I don't know, you must comment, is this whole issue of healing and compensation. Again, I think in Komati there was this idea of a museum. In Germany, they convert the old mines into museums, because our children don't know what a smelter looks like. We have new technology these days, but it's also like a museum can be a memorial, but maybe it can attract tourism. Maybe it's just important for that community to have something. So we'll do some guidelines, about what you could do around some of these kinds of things, if you agree. And anyway, so this is my last slide. What we'd like to hear from you, and especially from the government here. Firstly, do you agree that there should be two instruments, the code and the guidance document? And I think, Stephen, in terms of the debates with employers, this might be quite a good thing, having two instruments, or it might be a bad thing, I'm not sure. But it will be very important that government should have a view about one instrument or two. Because at the end of the day, government is the government. I'm not sure if there's anybody here from the DFFE, but there is a possibility, and we are exploring it, that the guidance note could be regulated under the Climate Change Act, because the minister there has the power to issue regulations. It might be desirable, it may not be desirable, because a regulation has got stronger weight than a guidance document, and how much weight do you want to give it, and whether the DFFE and the minister would be somebody who would be amenable to something like this, But the PCC has a power to advise. So the PCC can advise the president, and the president can instruct the minister. It's not impossible if we think it's desirable, but it'll be good to hear views. The second issue is the procedural justice. Do you agree that the issues that are raised are things that we should explore and put in the document? How social dialogue will be conducted, the different kinds of forums, categorizing, like Harun, some methodology around categorizing, and retrenchment processes. And then lastly, do you agree the interventions? And I've listed them there again, as those the interventions that we should provide guidance to about what could be discussed, bearing in mind that some of them require a government instrument to really give effect to. Thanks, Lebo.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That's painted a picture quite clearly for colleagues in the room, and like we said, we really do need some guidance in terms of this section, particularly, especially now that we are refining inputs and putting at least a first draft of a code together. So I just want to see if I don't want to say, I mean, there can be questions, but really looking more for inputs and comments from colleagues. We're going to start with you, Stephen, and then I'm going to take the gentleman at the back, and then we'll take another round.
Thank you, Elisa, for the presentation. I've got just few questions, and some will be comments. Lisa will know that you were director of Network, and you were dealing with the current labor market reforms. And you will know that there was a decision that was taken moving from fragmentation, codes, number of codes, and come up with one code. And I had in your presentation reflecting on number of economic transitions that will happen, and you suggesting that there should be this code only, and there might be other, as you have already reflected on the issue of information technology. And what do you say about that network posture in terms of fragmentation and coming up with one code and or building from the existing code? But I'm not speaking committing. You know, these issues will have also to go to the labor market chamber just to reflect on these issues. And I've been told that they've requested a presentation on this. Yeah. And the second thing is, you would know that this issue of a code was raised in the labor market chamber, and it seems as if the take on it, it was different understandings. The Minerals Council had their own understanding, therefore their posture on the code, they had their own posture on the code. And you will know that when you were here, there was the issue of Section 77 by, what is this? Solidarity, not Solidarity, AMCO, and their view on the impact of climate change on South Africa. Seems as if it was not agreeing with the view that, and this are, I'm raising this because union social partners will be impacted. And also the Department of Minerals and Energy came in that meeting, made a presentation, and made a commitment out of their presentation to say coal mines will remain with us for years. We are not going to close only coal mines. And these are the kind of different understandings that we have. And when people come to the code with that posture, it might raise quite a number of issues, how we are going to deal with these issues. And yes, UIF currently is paying retrenched workers, Lisa. They can claim from UIF, but I guess you are right to say in terms of retrenchment pay, we issue of small business, because you said UIF is not paying. I'm just saying it's paying. And the other issue that you raised, I think, if I heard you correctly, you were suggesting the code should come from a different ministry. If I'm correct, you'll correct me there. And I guess you would know that there was the issues that were dealing with retrenchments, and there were issues which legislation takes precedence between the legislation by Minerals and Energy and Labor Relations Act. And yes, the courts pronounced, and seems as if there's also issue that AMCO is taking forward. Therefore, maybe if you have a view on it too, given that this issue will be cross-cutting on a number of the departments, and your suggestion that it should be with certain department. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm gonna take you at the back.
Good day. My name is Terence Ngobeni. I'm actually from Ikemeling Environmental Development and Justice Organization. So my question was about rehabilitation. I think it's an addition and a question at the same time. So what if we rehabilitate during when the mines are still operating? Because it can like create job opportunities for the people and also healthy environment. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. I just want to check, are there any more questions? Can I address the issue that Stephen was raising? I'll go to Pamela. On the different understanding in terms of the code of good practice. I will agree there was a lot of misunderstanding in terms of what we meant. Was this an intervention for coal? Was this an intervention for a number of sectors? What interventions were we prioritizing? The time we went to the labor market chamber, we weren't clear on those details. So that's why we went back and we brought on board Lisa and Paul Benjamin to help us identify from the landscape at least, and through their legal and policy review around where are the gaps and where are our interventions best placed? So that's what we want to take back to the labor market chamber. I mean, I hear the different understandings across various ministries, and I was in the Section 77 when AMCU was there, and I listened attentively to the presentation from DMPR around the future of mining, which, by the way, I'm not in disagreement with. But there is an opportunity for us to also have an introspection of the coal and the coal value chain, right? I think there are a number of complexities that are at play, especially when we look at the coal value chain. CSIR also did a landscape report for the coal sector for us, which we will also bring to the labor market chamber meeting, because there are details there that we need to take into consideration. Yes, we will continue to export coal for as long as the international market is willing to accept it. But the fact of the matter is, as countries prioritize their own net zero targets and move away from coal-based electricity, that has a direct impact on our ability to export coal. And even if we wanted to, the coal that we are using right now, we could not use it optimally just for the domestic market. It's just basic economics. It would never work like that. So these are the things that we need to have an honest reflection about, over and above the fact that our coal fire stations are very old. They're quite old, and running them past their economic life means that for the electrons that we're going to get from that power station, we are going to pay way more for them. And that is a direct impediment on competitiveness when you look at businesses that need to use electricity input at the cheapest unit possible. So these are the number of issues. And this is why we say it's not just a coal sector question, but it expands across a number of sectors. So I understood that when we had the conversation initially, there may have been a confusion in terms of what it is that we were trying to address, where it is that we are. So it's important for us to go back to NEDLEC with a better picture of what it is that we're talking about. So I just wanted to address that, Stephen. By the way, the number of Section 77s are not going to stop. So AMCU, they're probably even going to come back. When I was in COSATU, we figured out a nice gap in the Section 77. And I don't know, COSATU is going to get angry that I'm saying this, but we figured out a nice gap that says if a matter remains unresolved, I can continue and be on strike. I don't even have to apply for a Section 77. I can just keep using the same certificate and still go on strike. So these thanks to me, yes. So these are the things that we need to start thinking about. I want to, Lisa, do you want to address these questions first, and then we get into the next round?
Stephen does raise an important question about Stephen. It's your call, really. I hear your point that it could be good to have one code on all forms of economic transition. Then you have to ask the question, well, that's why we've got the Code of Good Practice for Dismissal, you know? And there is a view. The Code of Good Practice for Dismissal includes a section on dismissal for operational requirements, which is really what an economic transition is about. So that's one view. The other view is that the difference between AI transition and an energy transition is that it's policy induced by government and by international organizations. And that's the point that Maleba made earlier on. Because it's an international obligation, so to speak, it needs a different dispensation. It needs more money to be brought to bear. Okay? So you could then say we must just have a special part or code where there is policy-induced change. But the international things that I've seen, and Jens can confirm, is that there is a shift from only the just energy transition to all transitions that are formed by climate change. Because we didn't do the just energy transition, we now have floods. So we need to have a just process. Because we messed up the world, we have a collective all of society approach that we must also help people who are affected by floods or drought or rising sea levels or whatever. So the suggestion that we have is that it is all the issues around mitigation and adaptation, where there is all of society policy at stake. It's not just because technology is changing or an employer didn't do well, and let the company go to rock and ruin. Having said that, it's not impossible that if we have a good code on this, that, remember I talked about the peace accord story, that other transitions will look at it, so it can have a halo effect if we do a useful code, which requires intensive engagement between business, labor, and government. Yeah, I think Lebo answered your second question. And yes, sorry, I was misunderstood. I know that UIF, retrenched workers do get UIF. Again, the issue that I was more raising is that if we are prepared to make a special dispensation for small business, could we make a special dispensation for a category of transitions which we regard as a climate change transition? And I don't know if Paul is online yet, but one of the things we thought about, very controversial, because you asked the next question, would the code be regulated by a different minister? That wasn't our suggestion. But what was a possibility is that, like essential services, there's a determination. This sector is an essential service. That the PCC would do an investigation, advise the president or advise the minister. The minister would declare coal mining of this grade coal a just transition sector. Not all the coal, because there's some coal we're going to export. And when that sector is determined a just transition sector, or the motor industry, or green hydrogen, or not green hydrogen, well, who knows what. But, then a whole lot of benefits start to flow. UIF benefits, training benefits, etc. That is a route. I don't know in South Africa's level of development at the moment if it can happen. But I would think that US government may want to think seriously, about that. It would also give the PCC a lot of power, and meat, it's an interesting idea. But the idea at the moment is that the code would be a code under the LRA. The guidance document would be an agreement agreed by Nedbank, and would be used as and when, a bit like a toolkit. It wouldn't have a legal status at all, but it would have a usefulness status. Terence, I think you're right. I think that's what, and when we do guidelines, to the extent that rehabilitation should be ongoing, we will look at that where applicable.
Thank you for that. I just want to check the hands that were up. Was it you? Can I start with you? And then you also had your hand up. All right. Just checking if there's anybody else. Okay, let's take those.
Good day. My question is simple. I want to know, since we are having an issue in terms of access to information, so that our community members, the youth, also the children in school, so that they can have insight about this just transition thing and the energy just transition. I don't know how can we as youth assist the PCC and the other stakeholders that are talking about the just energy transition, so that we can spread the message and maybe create some campaigns. I don't know how can we assist one another there.
Good day, colleagues. Masheti Mabuza, social impact expert. So just looking at a perspective type of overview, should the approach not be more on income generation rather than keeping people destitute and dependent on government systems that are already struggling currently as we look at it? Department of Labor is struggling. People are getting more displaced and unemployed. But if the approach was more income generating in terms of instead of creating dependency, then we'd really be moving the needle forward. And taking an example from Easy Equities, so Purple Group made a proposal to government to say instead of issuing social grants for kids through and through, which is dependency based, why not create an investment element where the child, when they reach 18, their investment has matured? So really, it's time to be agile and move away from dependency. Thank you.
Listen, thank you for that, and it's come up. It's come up a lot in the discussion that, you know, we seem to be looking at income support, social security, and the assumption is that these very good and well-intended initiatives create some form of dependency. And I just wanted to state this. You know, if we were operating in the context of Germany or whatever the case may be, we could give somebody a limited support. And because the economy is generating jobs, it's easier for them to find, you know, jobs someplace else. But we need to also be honest about the state of our economy and just the structural issues that hamper people to find jobs in either the same sector or in other sectors. Even though there's a lot of good intention, you know, when you look at the JIP and the number of sectors that they've prioritized, the truth of the matter is that bringing online new industrial capability takes time. That's just what it is. And when there is a displacement, we are in the South African context easily looking at somebody being out of a job for more than 2 years. That's the fact of the matter. And like Lisa has quite rightly said, is that there's a policy-induced element to the discussions around the transition, right? So on a moral level, it's really difficult to have this conversation without bringing up issues related to income support, as well as social security, more broadly. I grew up on a child grant, so it's not you're not throwing away the money. It is an investment that went into my education, and the fact that I sit here today is because my grandmother's child grant paid for transport so that I could go to school. So also it's how you look at it, right? And it's not to say that it works out like this in every case, hence maybe the thinking around it being something that creates dependency. But on a lot of fronts, and I mean, when the Minister of Basic Education was announcing the results of matriculants, she pointed to something quite important. The children who are cut off from child grants at age 18 but are still in school, they do worse compared to the kids that still have access to child grants up until they reach matric. In fact, a child is more likely to drop out of school because they have reached the 18-year threshold age and they need to get out of the system. So more so, it's an investment into education, and there's a lot of evidence that's pointed into this direction. But I do hear the sort of issue around let's move towards agility, thinking about things a bit more innovatively, and this is what this process is about. If these interventions that we're talking about need to be strengthened. So if we need to think about social security, but there has to be an element of active labor market policy attached to them, we're in no way averse to that type of thinking. If you're saying thinking about income support all on its own without thinking about marrying it very nicely with job matching, I think that's something we could definitely take away as an input. And if you're also saying that, I think that's why the issues related to enterprise. I'm not wearing my glasses. Did you say that? Is it enterprise support on yours, Lisa?
Yes.
Yeah, enterprise development, enterprise support. If we need to match those closer together so that it's not an intervention that is just specifically related to income support. I think that makes complete sense, and we can look at bringing those two much closer together. And then there was a question around how do we get these to schools? How do we get sort of like the knowledge to reach the youth? A very important question, which I will admit right at the back of, right at the top of my mind, without sufficient resources, that it becomes quite difficult to do, but it's clearly something that's in our best interest for us to begin to start mainstreaming. Not too sure how we do it with this process, and again, we're happy to get insights from yourself, but you are quite right. A lot of the, from the studies that we've done, a lot of the enterprise development, industrial development, we're looking at that in not even 2035, so it's like 2040 onwards. Who's that labor force? That's the young people of today. So it's in their best interest to understand the direction in which industrial development is going to move into. So I take your point 100%. Is there anybody else that wants to, or Lisa, you have any more reflection?
No, fine.
All right. Is there any more hands, any more reflections? Sure.
No, I think just to follow up on some of Steve's points, Lebo, maybe there should be some discussion with Steve about how best to position, this project, bearing in mind the history, for the NEDLAC structures.
Then we need guidance. I mean, we are here today. We need guidance around how best to structure that type of engagement. I don't know, Stephen, if you want to come back and sort of guide us here.
Lisa, I don't have ideas now, but I was also thinking about that too, and I thought the labor market chamber is not, given the issues that have been raised, are cost-cutting. And possibly if you request network, it should be pitched at main call, or all chambers must be invited. I don't know, the network chambers, but I feel that these issues are cross-cutting, and I think the drafts and the guidelines as discussion papers, they are welcomed from where I'm sitting, but I can speak for NEDLAC. But let me think about it. But it should be pitched at MANCO. It should not be only labor market chamber. You already know the history and all this, and this thing, I guess, is beyond the labor market chamber. Thank you.
Before you come in, Jens, I just quickly want to take that input.
Yeah, I don't know if it's possible, because where I'm from, there is mines, and obviously we are affected by them. So we've been trying to reach DMR, and I think most of people have been complaining about that. So I don't know if it's gonna be possible also maybe to come up with some structures or PCC to help DMR in responding like affected communities by mines. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. Unfortunately, I can't dictate to DMRE, to be quite honest, but I hear your point. And why we want to have the negotiation of this code in NetLeg is because we do want the participation of DMPR. I mean, what we can do is try to set up a dialogue. Please do get in touch with us so that we can try to set up that conversation. In fact, the minister used to be quite active in the meetings and had no problem availing resources as well as time to go and speak to affected communities. But I really hear your point, and please do connect with us in the break so that we can outline properly how we can sort of consolidate that type of engagement with the DMPR. Jens, you wanted to come in? Just very quickly, in terms of coming back to that point by Steve and the role of the labor market chamber vis-a-vis the trade investment, social development, and public finance. I think those are the four chambers. And if you look at it, I mean, those interventions that are proposed up there by Lisa and Paul, it really speaks to, if you remember, that holistic policy framework from the Just Transition Guidelines and the 2023 resolutions. I mean, if you look at job matching and placement, that's part of labor market, the active labor market policy, skills development, it's in there, skills development, lifelong learning, enterprise policies. You can find a hook for that. But I think, and what the 9 policy areas that Just Transition policy framework talks about is about policy coherence and coordination. And I think this is where perhaps we are somehow restricted. I agree that if it stays just in the labor market chamber, because what happens at the International Labour Conference, just to tell you that when this was discussed in 2023, you had very active participation from South Africa. So you had, your Sipho Ndebele from Department of Employment and Labour, you had Rifta Ajam from Fiducia, you had Kusatsu, you had Busa that was in the room, that was part of the committee. So they actually endorsed this. They agreed to this. They were part of developing this framework. So what I'm thinking, what would it take for social partners and government, so the tripartite constituents, to rally and become champions for this in South Africa, and and talk to the other line ministries that say, if we talk about just transition, it is that all of society approach that Lisa spoke about. It cannot be done just through labor, but you have to start somewhere, right? And I think this is what we are trying to do here. But I think there is, so sometimes when you hear from business in South Africa, we're a bit apprehensive. They've endorsed it at the International Labour Conference with 187 other countries, right? So I think that's a global commitment that has to also be translated to domestic policies, policy coherence and coordination. Thank you. Thank you, Jens, for that impassioned plea for us to please take this matter back into NEDLEC and to consider doing it over and above the labor market chamber, which I completely agree with. In fact, it was my intention that we would start at the men task team level. However, there was just appreciation for the fact that the labor market chamber had just finalized the labor law reform process, and as a part of it, there was that whole policy discussion around the issues related to climate proofing labor, and that's where the suggestion around the code of good practice emanated from, with the work that UWC did with Debbie Collier. So we had to start at the labor market chamber. I mean, hear from the chamber how we then direct this work. It's also subject to agreement from the social partners. But as we heard from the community constituency, who also made an equal passion plea
was around the fact that, they don't have representation in the labor market chamber. So this could only make sense as a ManCo task team. And it also helps us avoid the issue of fragmentation. And I made the example with the economic recovery work that we did in NetLab. We came up with a wonderful plan which had really good targets, and we had 5 commitments that were identified. I think post the process, task teams were developed. I know there was one around transport, there was an energy task team, and then there was a challenge in tracking sort of impact and activities because now we fell into the trap of just fragmentation again. So in a ManCo task team, I mean, it makes complete sense, but also managing our expectations. ManCo task teams don't resolve everything. I think, do they still have the cost of living task team in NetLink? It's still there. I'm not too sure what's been achieved in that particular task team. So we must also be mindful of some of the dynamics that take place as a result of social dialogue. We have done really well in the sense that we're probably going to wrap up before lunch. I wanted to check, Matilda, so there's nothing yet from our international experience?
Right now.
Has he joined?
No, he can't manage.
He can't, okay, no, that's fine. We wanted to give an international experience from Germany, but and really what Tobias was going to come in and do is just give like practical examples in terms of how they managed their negotiation around their just transition processes. But this process is not done yet, so we could still have time to have those types of engagements. I'd like to, is Paul on the line? Paul, I don't know if having listened to today's discussion, if you've got anything maybe you would like to quickly input before I take us into the way forward section.
Hello, yes, I am online. Just would you like me to talk at this point?
Yes, I'd like for you to talk at this point. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid I haven't been able to listen into any of today's deliberations. I'm told they were particularly useful presentations. What I've done in the previous 2 sessions is just to clarify the legal issues concerning the potential documents that could be issued to deal with climate change. So the project and the titles refer to a code of good practice. And as we know, code of good practice is a reference to a term used in labor law and particularly the LRA. And basically, codes of practice can have a legal effect, although that may not be the case with all codes of good practice. It depends on the subject matter. Basically, codes of good practice have to be taken into account in applying and interpreting the law. And as we know, codes of good practice have particular relevance where there are broad obligations, such as ones of fairness, for instance, the obligation on employers to act fairly when dismissing or considering dismissal. And so that has a particular relevance in the just transition context, where there may well be consultations under sections 189 or facilitation under section 189A, where plants are closing or repositioning themselves or reducing their size as a result of climate change pressures. So if we look narrowly at what the Code of Good Practice could do, the area where it may well have a stronger legal effect would be to, in a sense, buttress the obligations that employers would have in a retrenchment situation, with particular reference to the circumstances of climate change. And that may include, for instance, obligations as to additional consultation or consultation at an earlier stage than might otherwise be the strict requirement of the LRA. Secondly, it could specify both for consultation and in fact for collective bargaining what information should be disclosed to underline and to make transparent a consultation or collective bargaining process. And thirdly, the steps that have to be taken to, as it were, mitigate the consequences of a retrenchment, which involve, for instance, a range of topics: retraining, reallocation to other work, transfers, work in other projects, a range of things. So all of those are issues an employer is required to consider in the statutory consultations, and a code would really try and underwrite that process by specifying in greater detail. And as many of the papers have indicated, what an employer should do may vary between different groups of employers. For instance, with older employees, for instance, the onus is more on looking at early retirement or moving towards, social benefits post-work. With younger workers, it may be more about reskilling or looking at other opportunities or opportunities in sort of, green types of work. So that's really the function of a code of good practice. To the extent that we may have collective bargaining, there is an existing code of good practice about the nature of collective bargaining, and that would apply. And the point to make here is that collective bargaining is, there's no legal duty, so that to bargain, there's a very, very limited role for the court and the CCMA, and therefore a code of good practice on issues of collective bargaining, insofar as that is pursued for climate change, would be about best practice rather than any legal obligation. If we look at other types of documents, there are really a couple. The first, which we can identify, is, and I'm sure this has been discussed already by Lisa, is the powers of the Minister of, is it FFE now, to make regulations under the Climate Change Act. So those powers are both quite specific about the implications of the manner in which climate change is to be applied, and then there is a sort of general, what's often called an umbrella clause. And on issues that are not specifically about labor law, but more about the sort of, I suppose, the climate change aspects, it would be appropriate for regulations to be issued. And I think if we look back to the COVID pandemic, in many ways, the role of regulations under the Climate Change Act could be seen as being equivalent to the role of regulations issued under the Emergency Powers Act, Disaster Management, sorry. And as you know, the extensive regulations were issued during COVID, dealing with a wide range of responses to COVID, both in the workplace and more generally. And I think a lot of creativity and thought was put into this, and there is a great potential for the type of regulation that the government would like to see, and the type of binding requirements on players in the market, that they could be dealt with through regulations under the Climate Change Act. I haven't seen any documents that try and flesh that out further, what could be done, but it's obviously an important area. It's not particularly a labour law issue, although it may go through consultation at NEDLAC, and the power would lie with the Department of the Environment and the Minister. And I think there's a requirement there that all regulations under that Act be tabled in Parliament. The third would be then other types of documents. Is there a need for general guidance documents? Should the presidential body dealing with climate change issue particular policies? Should any particular minister do so? In the absence of a specific provision in a statute authorizing regulations, those documents would merely reflect a statement of policy. They wouldn't be binding, but they might indicate an attitude or expectations. So those three documents are what one can flesh out. It may well be that certain acts are used, for instance, NEMA, more specifically, to regulate responses to climate change. But so I think with it's quite important to understand that. I think that there's a sense, certainly in some of the other constituencies, that a code of good practice in particular could do a wide range of issues that are beyond the legal powers of NEDLAC or the Minister of Employment and Labour, through a code. So that's just an overview of the sort of, the regulatory options, and obviously it's different aspects of climate change can be regulated in different ways, but there's clearly a need for an overall strategic approach as to how that will be done. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, and for sort of setting up that context for us in the room. And just to say to colleagues, when we spoke to Labour yesterday, they said they're tired of people saying that they're drafting documents and providing adequate guidance. They want everything legislated because nothing is happening. So it's about that. So to explain, but they said no, they're tired. Everything must be done through regulations. They no longer trust anything they've been burnt. So these are the insights that we're getting from the various consultations, and I think that's why we've taken the time to listen to each stakeholder grouping quite intensively. I have indicated that we will be closing lunch. I just want to see the way forward slide, if we can just put that on the screen. Oh, sure, you can come in before I...
No, thanks, Lubu. And really thanks for a great presentation by Lisa and presentations that we had earlier. By way of introduction, my name is Thabo Chauke. I work for GIZ in a section called H2SA, which is about promoting green hydrogen in South Africa. So I've been listening attentively, and I was hoping that we will get some responses on the question that Lisa was posing, especially on the issues of guidance document versus a code of good practice, because at least from Green GIZ's perspective, and I thought I should just share these perspectives with yourselves. because we also been grappling with some of the issues that Lisa touched on. I must say I support the interventions that have been identified in Lisa's presentation. So on GSS side, especially on the work on green hydrogen, we came up with some guidance document and deals with the community development toolkit, which at least the green hydrogen private developers find it quite useful in their consultation with the communities in order to do the work. And in addition to that, we couldn't come up with something that is more binding. That is why I just wanted to, I was yearning to hear whether people are leaning towards something that is more binding or what. But side, we had to come with a guidance document, which, like I say, there is an appetite to use it, and they find it to be quite useful. In addition, we also came up with a community appreciation toolkit, which, as the speakers have alluded to, and I think this is another issue that some of the emerging sectors or industries are going to grapple with, is that there is a lot of frustration, as Levo said in the morning, that communities are now asking for tangible benefits, and a green hydrogen sector as an emerging sector is also facing those challenges. So we had to come up with a community beneficiation mechanism that can tangibly, so if you are a private developer, you have to show what benefits will accrue to the communities. And there are different ways that you can think about communities. For instance, they can always, there's nothing really that stops communities. They can be assisted to be generators of renewable energy so that private project developers do not have to generate their own renewable energy, but out from the community. So there are other benefits, but also other benefits that private developers themselves are expected to generate and make sure that the benefits accrue to those communities. But all of these instruments that I'm mentioning are guides, guidance document, nothing more serious than that. So that's why I was curious to find out whether is the mood more of having something that is more binding, which from our side, we think it will be a little bit difficult as an institution, because there is a value, as Lisa said, for a guidance document for certain things, even though we know that it's less binding. But there is a merit to have that, because first, it helps government also to collate some information to see what is the behavior, so that by the time you start to have something that is more binding, you will have now be coming from a point of saying, from the experience, we saw the flaws of guidance document, especially if it has to address a serious issue such as XYZ that we will have identified. So I thought I should share with you this perspective, and also to share these toolkits with the meeting, and then you will take it for yourselves whether these documents are useful or not. But I thought that's the input I should share with this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is very useful. If you could please share those toolkits with us, it would help us greatly. We may even just reach out to you to see what's been the reception from communities, reception from business in the area, and how these have worked out. Bridget, you'll remember the Green Hydrogen Summit. The developers were talking about the fact that they want to promise community that benefits will accrue, but they don't even know. They are still in the process. They're very initial stages. They don't want to overpromise, but they're also facing hostility from community members that see an operation taking place and nothing is coming in terms of benefits to themselves. So that's why we say, like, these types of codes of good practice, they create a leveled playing field. There's no expectation, under expectation. We create some sort of certainty and practical rules for the game. And let me just say, I hear your hesitance about like laws and over regulation. These are the minimum standards, the minimum, you know. And as Lisa would have mentioned earlier, when we get into the conversation around practical guidance, I mean, tell you what best practice is in the rest of the world. So we made reference to the fact that, you know, in Germany, in Canada, before decommissioning, 5 years prior, you start to have conversations with community members. Because if you're thinking of bringing on board enterprise development, that takes time. And that's not something you can wrap up in the 120 days that the LRA gives you in terms of a consultation with your staff. And just to indicate, if there's anything you would like for us to know, anything you'd like to, you probably will apply your mind to later on after this meeting. We welcome any input whatsoever. We are in the information collection process. So we'd love to receive as much information as possible. And maybe let me just say this around again, the codes of good practice. I think for me anyway, when we were dealing with COVID-19 in the workplace, and there was just no understanding in terms of what should the employer provide, what is PPE, when should an employee stay away from work, and when that employee stays away from work, does no pay apply? There was just a lot of confusion, right? And I saw something happen that was incredible. We put that thing in the government gazette, and I'm telling you, 2 weeks later, all the places had visors, everybody had masks. It was clear because we had defined what the rules were, right? And it had uniformity across workplaces, and it was embedded in the practice of the workplace. So now, with the just transition again, should I talk to you 2 days before I tell you this thing is shutting down, or should I speak to you 2 years before? So there's no rules of it. And it's also unfair, even for employers, because they will be doing what's right, and then the guy next door doesn't. So you're incurring so much costs doing what's right, and there's competitors not doing that. So the level field, even there's just no level playing field in that regard, and that's also an impediment for business and its continuity. So I just wanted to raise. So we shouldn't be concerned that the South Africans go again creating another level of regulation and red tape. This is not what this process is. I promise you. Okay, now I need to get to that way forward slide. Stephen, you want to say something?
Yeah, maybe I don't know whether my colleague, I guess the discussion and the mood and the temperature in the room, when Lisa was doing the presentation, it was the issue of a code and a guidelines or guidance document. It's just two documents that we spoke about, not either. It's both of them. And the code, and as they have said, it's got where there's legal implications, and also it's got a little bit of guidance. But a guiding document goes deeper than the code, my understanding, Lisa. No, let me not confuse. But let me say the room and the mood was the two documents, not either. And I think that seems to be the consensus and the expectation. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. You want to come in, Lisa?
I think I agree with Steve. Just to clarify, the code would have two kind of regulatory calls. The one is binding, and that really will be mostly linked to retrenchments, disclosure of information, consultation, because that's already what is in the LRA. The other part of the code would be practical guidance, which, and I think Paul tried to explain, has a much lower legal obligation, but not impossible, depending on how a process unfolds. A guidance document has no legal standing, it has moral standing. And I mean, I think your experience, echoes also what Lebo was saying about, in the COVID kind of period. It seems to me that what you're saying, Steve, is that we should go out of here supporting the two codes with the differential legal impact. It's not to say, because this is a contested terrain, both in government and in business and even in labor it's contested, because there are people in labor who say, we don't believe in the just transition. It's true. And having a code they might feel is a threat to that, So I think as this contestation happens, it may be that the fallback position is a guidance thing, or you decide as the PCC, a phased approach. It's all about, in my language, a balance of forces. The stronger the pro people are, the greater the ears to government, the greater the proactive capacity of government, the more you will be able to achieve. But I think, the point, I'll go back to the point of Jens earlier on. How you introduce this to social partners in NEDLAC is important. And there was a history which also unfortunately involved me and so on. So I think there needs to be a tactical discussion. Maybe we can start it a bit after, this meeting. Thanks.
Yeah, the history involves me too. So maybe Paul is the only neutral one in that discussion. All right, colleagues, I'd like to take you through a bit of a way forward to kind of map the whole picture of this development of a code as well as the supplementary instruments, whether that be a regulation or a political guide. We'll see how we structure that. So we started here with the roundtable discussions. Next, and just to say, we're not having these sessions for the sake of just listening. It's going towards also strengthening the legal and policy review that has been developed, which is the first step towards the first draft of the Code of Good Practice. And then after that, we will be meeting with the Labour Market Chamber to make a proposal or to give this presentation to them, but really hoping that we can establish a forum or a task team that can be dedicated towards negotiating on a draft Code of Good Practice. Alongside this process, which is why Thabo, I invited you to please avail yourself and to send us resources, because what we'll be doing is synthesizing available research and reports that exist, as well as toolkits, so that we can inform the work of the task team that's looking at this Code of Good Practice and the supplementary instruments. And that's going to take us through a penultimate draft code. We're making progress in the PCC, at least with me. We're not meeting hotels. So we want to, in this meeting in NEDLAC, we want to go into communities. So we'll be reaching out to yourselves to help us earmark the appropriate communities, because we want to also test some of these instruments, the code itself, with affected communities to kind of understand at a minimum level that could be sufficient. So we also open this process to some sort of public consultation. And then we hope to this process by the end of December. Let me be honest, the money for this project ends in the end of December, so it must be finished by the end of December. So we've given ourselves a bold target to be done by the end of December. But we know the nature of NEDLAC negotiations, right? Sometimes they just go beyond. But really what we'd like to do is at least finalize the drafting of the code within this year and finalize consultations with stakeholders. Because in the meeting with Labour yesterday, the feeling was that codes of this nature will impact broader than the people who are able to make these types of meetings. So we also, in the interest of procedural justice, must endeavor to go and speak to as many people as possible. So this is as far as we go with the page program. So this is just to say when we do call you again, please do avail yourselves. You seem to pick up that maybe this code hasn't gone the way that you thought it would, given the conversation that we had here today. You are more than welcome to reach out to us and talk to us. But as Lisa has mentioned, after we hand this over to NEDLAC task team, the balance of forces then takes over. And whoever has got, the bigger muscle in terms of negotiating capacity, more often than not manages to win the day. So, but let me give credit to NEDLAC as a body for social dialogue. It's managed to ensure that the views are not to the detriment of another social partner. So this is our process for the remainder of the year. So don't be surprised when you get another email from us, or whether we ask to speak to you bilaterally, so that we can understand things a bit better, and that will be us for the remainder of the year. Let me take this time to thank you all for participating in this session. Jens said when we started with this process, it's not the number of people that end up showing up, but the people who do show up are the people that you were meant to be speaking to. So thanks for availing yourselves. Your input has been very valuable, and we'll take all of this into consideration. Just to thank the ILO team for your participation and your support in this process, to thank Lisa and Paul, who are doing all of the heavy lifting for us, to thank the AV team, the caterers, as well as the admin team for helping us with all of the logistics to get these roundtables going, and for yourselves for staying throughout the duration of this meeting. Do travel safe, and please do stay for lunch. Thank you.